Nestled in the rolling hills of northern Vermont was the town of Millfield, a place so picturesque it could have been plucked from a postcard. With its white picket fences, maple-lined streets, and a population just shy of 3,000, Millfield was the kind of town where neighbors waved from their porches, kids rode bikes until dusk, and the sharpest danger came in the form of gossip whispered over coffee at the local diner. But on a frosty morning in November 2017, that peace shattered. Maggie Carver, a 56-year-old elementary school teacher beloved by nearly everyone in town, was found dead in her home on Alder Street. It was Ruthie Lang, her next-door neighbor and longtime friend, who made the discovery. She'd noticed Maggie's porch light still on well after sunrise. Something Maggie, a creature of habit, never forgot to turn off. When Ruthie knocked and got no answer, she tried the door. It was unlocked. What she found inside would haunt her forever. Maggie was lying in her living room, her throat slit. The room showed signs of a violent struggle. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, a broken picture frame. But nothing was missing. No valuables taken. No signs of forced entry. Just one chilling detail. The front door had been left wide open. The town was stunned. Maggie had no known enemies. She was kind, generous, and deeply involved in the community. She baked cookies for her students, volunteered at the library, and still sent handwritten birthday cards. Her death didn't just shock Millfield, it cracked its very foundation. For weeks, the investigation yielded nothing. No suspects, no motive, no answers. The police urged residents to remain calm, but fear crept in like the winter frost. People started locking their doors, watching their neighbors, wondering if the killer was someone they knew. Then, 3 months later, it happened again. In February 2018, the body of Joel Whitaker was found in the woods behind Millfield Elementary. Joel was a 34-year-old handyman. Quiet, dependable, and well-liked. He'd gone missing 2 days earlier. His body was discovered by a group of teenagers sledding near the tree line. He'd been stabbed multiple times. His wallet and phone were still on him. There were no signs of a robbery, no signs of a struggle. Just like Maggie, Joel had been killed with chilling precision. And just like Maggie, Joel had left his door unlocked. The town spiraled into panic. 2 murders, no suspects, no clear connection except one. Joel had done odd jobs for Maggie. Just a week before her death, he'd fixed her porch light. Some said he had a soft spot for her. Others whispered it was more than that. But whatever the truth was, it died with him. The Vermont State Police brought in outside help. Profilers, forensic experts. They combed through both crime scenes, looking for anything that could tie the murders together. Then came the break. A partial fingerprint was found on the broken picture frame in Maggie's living room. It was faint, almost smudged, but it was enough. It matched someone in the system. Eli Carver, Maggie's estranged nephew. Eli had a record: petty theft, drug possession, a few bar fights. He hadn't been seen in Millfield in over a decade. Most people assumed he'd left for good, but he hadn't. He'd been living in an abandoned hunting cabin just outside town, off the grid. When police searched the cabin, they found Maggie's missing jewelry tucked inside a rusted toolbox. Items her family hadn't even realized were gone. They also found Joel's fingerprints on a coffee mug, suggesting he'd been there too. Under questioning, Eli confessed. He said he'd come to Maggie for help, money, a place to stay. She refused. They argued. Things got out of hand. He claimed it wasn't supposed to happen that way. As for Joel, Eli said Joel saw him leaving Maggie's house the night she died. Joel confronted him days later, threatened to go to the police. Eli panicked. 2 lives, taken to protect a secret. The trial was swift. Eli was sentenced to life without parole. But the damage had been done. Millfield would never be the same. Maggie's classroom was turned into a memorial reading nook. Joel's tools were donated to a local trade school. And every November, the town holds a candlelight vigil, not just to remember the victims, but to remind themselves that even in the safest places, darkness can find a way in, and sometimes it walks right through the front door. Just when Millfield thought the nightmare had ended, it returned. more brutal, more chilling, and more confusing than ever. On the morning of June 3, 2018, Derek Humes, 39, was found dead in his second-floor apartment above the town's antique shop. Derek was a quiet man, almost invisible in daily life. He worked as a librarian at the Millfield Public Library and was known for two things: on records and maps. He lived alone, kept to himself, never caused trouble. But that morning, a neighbor noticed Derek's mailbox overflowing and his cat meowing nonstop from the window. When police entered the apartment, they found a scene disturbingly familiar. Derek was lying face down in his living room. His throat had been slit. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the carpet. A tall bookshelf had toppled over, scattering books across the floor, signs of a struggle. But once again, nothing was missing. His wallet, laptop, and even a rare first edition town ledger sat untouched. And just like Maggie Carver and Joel Whitaker before him, there were no signs of forced entry. But this time, there was something new. Caught on the clasp of Derek's wristwatch was a single red thread. Investigators sent it to the lab. Days later, the results came back. It was an exact match to a red fiber found months earlier, embedded in the weave of Maggie Carver's living room rug. Same dye, same weave, same origin. For the first time, police had physical evidence linking two of the victims. But the breakthrough raised more questions than it answered. Derek and Maggie had never met. They had no mutual friends, no shared workplaces, no overlapping routines. Derek hadn't even lived in Millfield when Maggie was killed. He'd moved back just 2 months earlier after a brief stint in Boston. There was no reason for their paths to have crossed. Except one: Millfield. The town itself was the only common thread. As news of Derek's murder spread, Millfield descended into full-blown panic. The idea of a random killer had been terrifying, but the idea of a methodical one, someone who chose victims without pattern, without motive, was worse. Parents pulled their kids from summer camps. The 4th of July parade was canceled for the first time in 72 years. Gun sales tripled in a week. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and security cameras. The town that once left its doors unlocked now lived behind chains and alarms. And somewhere in Millfield, a killer waited, watching, planning, choosing. The red thread was the only clue. Investigators traced it to a specific type of wool used in vintage military uniforms, specifically a ceremonial sash worn by officers in the 1940s. Rare, obscure, but not impossible to find. Detectives began combing through local antique shops, estate sales, and online forums. They interviewed collectors, reenactors, and anyone with a known interest in military memorabilia. And that's when they found something strange. A man named Vincent Hale, a 61-year-old retired tailor, had recently donated several boxes of old clothing to the Millfield Historical Society. Among them, a moth-eaten red officer's sash from 1943. It had been stored in his attic for decades until he gave it away in early 2017. The timing? Just months before Maggie Carver's murder. But Vincent had no connection to the victims. He barely remembered donating the boxes. And the Historical Society? They'd sold most of the contents at a spring fundraiser. No records, no receipts, no way to trace who bought what. The trail went cold again. But the killer didn't, because Derek Humes wouldn't be the last. Enter Detective Elise Monroe. Brought in from Burlington after the third murder, Monroe was known for her sharp instincts and relentless attention to detail. She wasn't flashy. She didn't chase headlines. But she had a reputation. When cases went cold, she made them burn again. From the moment she arrived in Millfield, Monroe sensed something was off, not just with the murders, but with the town itself. The way people spoke in half-truths. The way they avoided eye contact when she asked about the past. It wasn't fear. It was something older. Something buried. She started where most detectives would end, the crime scenes. She walked through Maggie Carver's home, Joel Whitaker's cabin, and Derek Humes' apartment. She took notes others had missed. A scuff mark on a baseboard. A faint scent of pipe tobacco. A pattern in the placement of the bodies, each one facing east. Then she moved to interviews. Dozens of them. Friends, co-workers, neighbors. Most had nothing new to offer, but a few mentioned something curious. Each victim had recently shown an interest in Millfield's history. Maggie had been researching old school records. Joel had been fixing up a historic barn. And Derek had been knee-deep in the town's archives. So Monroe went to the library. It was a quiet afternoon. Rain tapped against the windows as she wandered the back aisles, past dusty shelves and forgotten microfilm. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it. Tucked behind a row of outdated census books was a plain manila folder. No label, no markings, just dust and silence. Inside, a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, and black and white photographs. The headlines were chilling. Local teacher Ellen Grange missing, foul play suspected. Librarian Mark Dillon vanishes without a trace. Third disappearance in 2 years baffles authorities. The dates? 1972 to 1975. The victims? A schoolteacher, a librarian, a handyman. All gone, all unsolved. Monroe's pulse quickened. She laid the photos side by side. Ellen Grange bore an uncanny resemblance to Maggie Carver. Mark Dillon had the same quiet demeanor as Derek. Even the handyman, a man named Thomas Kearns, looked like he could have been Joel's uncle. Coincidence? Monroe didn't believe in those. She dug deeper. The folder included a faded pamphlet, handwritten, mimeographed, and stamped with a strange symbol, a circle of alder leaves surrounding a single eye. The Alder Circle. According to the pamphlet, it was a secretive society formed in the 1950s by a group of Millfield residents who believed the town was slipping into moral decay. Their mission? To preserve order through quiet correction. Anonymous letters. Social pressure. In some cases, disappearances. The group had disbanded in the late 70s after a scandal involving a missing teenager. But Monroe now had a theory. Someone was targeting the modern-day echoes of that group. Not just random victims, but symbolic ones. Maggie, the teacher, Derek, the librarian, Joel, the handyman, all mirrors of the original Alder Circle members. But why now? And who was behind it? Monroe pinned the photos to her motel wall, drawing lines between past and present. She knew this wasn't just about revenge. It was ritual, intentional, a message. And the message wasn't finished. Because if the killer was following the original Alder Circle, there were still more roles to fill. And more people in Millfield who had no idea they were next. Detective Elise Monroe had seen darkness before, but Millfield's shadows ran deeper than most. Her investigation into the Alder Circle had peeled back the town's polished veneer, revealing a legacy of secrets, shame, and silent cruelty. Formed during the paranoia of the Cold War, the Circle had operated like a secret court, exposing cheating spouses, outing suspected communists, and punishing anyone they deemed morally unfit. Their methods were quiet but brutal: anonymous letters, public humiliation, firings, and in some cases, forced exile. They called it justice. Others called it terror. Maggie Carver's grandfather had been one of the Circle's founding members. Derek Hume's uncle had served as its unofficial archivist. Both men had taken their secrets to the grave. But someone else hadn't forgotten. Someone had been watching, waiting. And now they were striking back. Elise compiled a list of every known member of the Alder Circle and traced their living descendants. Most had moved away or passed on. Only a handful remained in Millfield. Among them, Catherine Doyle, the town's current mayor. Catherine was sharp, composed, and fiercely protective of Millfield's image. When Elise confronted her with the truth about her father's involvement in the Circle, Catherine didn't deny it. She simply said that was a different time. We did what we thought was right. But someone clearly disagreed. Security was tightened. Catherine was placed under 24-hour protection. Patrols were increased. Cameras installed. Elise even moved into the mayor's guest house to keep watch herself. But the killer was always a step ahead. On the morning of January 12, 2019, Millfield awoke to a fresh blanket of snow. The town square, usually quiet in winter, was eerily still. A maintenance worker clearing the paths was the first to see it. At the base of the war memorial stood a figure slumped against the stone. It was Mayor Catherine Doyle. Her throat had been slit. D. A red wool thread was found on her coat. Next to her, nailed into a wooden post, was a hand-carved message. Justice, long delayed, is justice denied. MLK SW. The town was paralyzed. The killer had struck at the heart of Millfield's leadership, under protection, under watch, in the most public place imaginable. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a statement. Elise stood in the snow, staring at the message. The quote wasn't random. It was deliberate. A condemnation, a warning, and a promise. The killer believed they were righting a historic wrong. That the sins of the Alder Circle had gone unpunished for too long. And now they were delivering justice, one bloodline at a time. But Elise knew something else. The killer wasn't finished. There were still names on the list. And one of them was hers. Millfield remains quiet today, but it is a different kind of quiet. Gone are the days of unlocked doors and neighborly assumptions. The murders of Maggie Carver, Joel Whitaker, Derek Humes, and Mayor Catherine Doyle left scars that no snowfall could cover. The town's charm, once its pride, now feels like a mask that was finally torn away. Detective Elise Monroe's investigation didn't just catch a killer, it unearthed a legacy. The Alder Circle, once whispered about in half-truths and buried in dusty archives, was dragged into the light. Their records were made public. Their actions, once justified as moral correction, were exposed for what they truly were: fear, control, and cruelty masquerading as virtue. The town council voted unanimously to strike the names of Alder Circle members from public buildings. Statues were taken down. Streets renamed. School curriculums rewritten to include the truth. For the first time, Millfield began to reckon with its past, not as a footnote, but as a warning. Some residents left, unable to bear the weight of what had been revealed. Others stayed, determined to rebuild something better. A memorial now stands in the town square, not for the Alder Circle, but for their victims, past and present. It bears no names, only a single inscription. Truth is not always kind, but it is always necessary. As for Elise Monroe, she left Millfield quietly just as the snow began to melt. She never gave interviews, never wrote a book, but those who knew her say she still keeps a red thread in her coat pocket, a reminder that justice, no matter how long delayed, must never be denied again. And somewhere in the hills of Vermont, the wind still whispers through the trees. But now Millfield listens.
Eliza Wren was invisible by design. At 46, she had cultivated her obscurity with the precision of a scholar and the persistence of someone who found safety in the quiet. As the head of archival research at the Providence Historical Society, a gray stone building tucked behind the busier thoroughfares of College Hill, Eliza moved through her life like a whisper in the stacks. Few visited the archives. Fewer still knew her name. That suited her just fine. The Historical Society's reading room smelled of old paper and dry wood. Its long oak tables bore the soft scarring of decades of elbows and fountain pens. Dust settled there like snow, disturbed only by the occasional graduate student or the rare true crime writer seeking the scent of the past. Eliza reigned over this forgotten kingdom with a strange kind of reverence. She was a curator of ghosts. Her days followed a rhythm: the unlocking of the wrought iron gate at precisely 8:55 a.m., the creak of the brass-handled door at 9 o'clock, the warming gurgle of the electric kettle in the break room by 9:05. She drank jasmine tea in a cracked porcelain mug painted with violets. She brought her own tea bags in a small wooden box. No one else in the office liked the scent. Her office was at the end of a narrow corridor, lit by a single frosted window that filtered daylight into pale rectangles on the floor. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their drawers labeled in her neat script: obituaries, 1865 to 1889, city census, 1920 to 1930, railroad charters, defunct. Her desk was always organized, always clean, save for the perpetual layer of fine dust that no amount of wiping could remove. That dust was as much a part of her world as the paper she touched daily, fragments of lives long extinguished. People said Eliza Wren was quiet, meticulous, possibly a little odd. She had the kind of face that aged well, angular, fine-featured, with pale blue eyes and a streak of silver in her dark hair that she made no effort to conceal. She dressed in long skirts and cardigans, all in shades of gray, plum, and faded green, the tones of old book covers. She wore no jewelry, save for a narrow silver ring on the middle finger of her right hand. No one ever asked her about it. She didn't invite questions. There were whispers, as there always are. That she'd once been married, years ago. That her name had been different once. That she'd lived in New York, or maybe Montreal. That she'd been involved in some kind of scandal, something to do with a museum, or a manuscript, or a death. No one knew for certain. No one remembered to whom she'd been married. The name had been forgotten, or perhaps never spoken. In the end, it didn't matter. Eliza Wren existed now as a fixture, a part of the archival building itself, solid, unchanging, largely unnoticed. Except by Pascal. Pascal was a cat of considerable personality, black from ears to tail, with eyes the color of moonlight on water. He belonged to no one and yet had chosen Eliza, appearing on her back porch one gray October morning 8 years ago and never leaving. He was the only creature who could be said to love her, though he expressed it in typically feline ways, curling on her lap when she read in the evening, delivering occasional dead mice to her doorstep, and yowling furiously at shadows on the wall when thunderstorms rolled in. Their red brick duplex stood on a quiet street shaded by elms, far enough from downtown that traffic noise never reached her window. Eliza occupied the upper floor. The downstairs unit was currently vacant, though she never minded the lack of neighbors. Her world was one of paper and silence, and that was how she liked it. But silence, as it turns out, can be treacherous. The day she disappeared began like any other. It was October 22, 1998. A Thursday. The morning light was pale and clouded, and the sidewalks were scattered with the papery remains of sugar maples and ash. Eliza rose at 6 o'clock, as she always did, fed Pascal precisely 1/3 of a can of salmon pâté, and listened to the local NPR station while she made toast. She wore a charcoal gray skirt, a forest green blouse, and her soft wool coat. She left the house at 8:10 and walked the 12 blocks to the Historical Society in 23 minutes. At 9:04, she was seen unlocking the glass display cabinet in the reading room to rotate the featured document. It was a Civil War-era letter, yellowed and delicate, written by a Union soldier to his mother. She replaced it with a city ordinance from 1902 regulating fire escapes, a dry piece, but with fascinating marginalia. She made a note in the display log, initialed it in her tight, looping hand, and returned the key to her desk drawer. At 11:17, she logged onto the database system to cross-reference a request submitted the week before, something about property transfers on Benefit Street during the 1880s. She printed a list of microfiche references and filed it in the patron request tray. At 12:30, she ate lunch in the staff kitchen, a thermos of tomato soup, a pear, and 3 saltines. She did not speak to anyone, though she nodded politely at Jeff from Restoration, who was microwaving something that smelled strongly of curry. At 3:15, she entered the archive vault to retrieve a box labeled Baptism Records, St. Ignatius Parish, 1875 to 1888. The entry log showed her signature. The motion-sensor camera captured her entering. It did not record her leaving. By 5:30, the reading room had emptied, and the last of the interns had gone home. At 6:03, the evening security guard began his rounds. Eliza's coat still hung on the peg in her office. Her tea mug sat on her desk, the last sip cold and untouched. At 6:22, the alarm was set for the night. No one noticed she was missing until the following morning. The police were notified. Detective Avery Moran of the Providence PD was assigned the case. She had just turned 37 and had been working homicide for nearly a decade. She found the Historical Society profoundly unsettling, not because it was haunted, as one of the interns suggested, but because it was so easy to get lost inside it. Physically. Psychologically. The building had too many doors that led nowhere, too many staircases that doubled back on themselves. It was a maze built from layers of time. They found no signs of struggle. Nothing taken. Nothing broken. Her apartment was in perfect order. Pascal had not been fed, and when Moran opened the door with the spare key provided by the landlord, the cat bolted past her and ran up the nearest tree, hissing. Her purse remained at the office. Her keys. Her notebook. Her ring was gone. There was no note. No sign of foul play. No body. She had, in every observable way, simply vanished. And yet the story didn't end there. Over the months that followed, reports trickled in, whispers, rumors, sightings. A woman matching Eliza's description seen in a second-hand bookstore in Brattleboro, Vermont, reading an out-of-print anthology of 19th-century funeral customs. Another in a train station in Albany, standing silently beside the arrivals board, watching the names flicker and change. A third in a cemetery in Salem, sketching the inscription on a crumbling headstone. None of them were confirmed. The surveillance images were too blurry. The witnesses unsure. Each time, Detective Moran followed the lead. Each time, she returned with nothing. But the mystery lingered. In the years that followed, Eliza Wren became something of a folk tale. The librarian who disappeared into the past. The archivist who vanished into her own vault. She was mentioned in online forums about unsolved disappearances, catalogued among the inexplicable, alongside stories of time travelers, secret societies, and government cover-ups. Some said she had found something she wasn't supposed to. Others that she had gone willingly, stepped sideways into another world. One where records whispered and history breathed. No one could say for certain. And Pascal, despite his long watch at the window, never told. Detective Lyle Rohn was 23 days from retirement when the call came in. He'd been staring into a bitter cup of precinct coffee, waiting out his morning like a man on the final mile of a long walk. The weather had turned, a low mist clung to the city like wet gauze, and the air tasted of salt and coming cold. October in Providence was always dramatic, burning trees, long shadows, and a hush in the streets like something was holding its breath. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone on his desk. Missing person. Eliza Wren. Historical Society researcher. Neighbor flagged it. Weird smell. Flickering attic light. 3 days no contact. Rohn sighed. Not loud enough for anyone to hear, but deep enough to touch his ribs. He had intended to spend the day inventorying old case files and pretending to organize his desk drawers. He had a retirement party scheduled in 3 weeks. 2 kinds of sheet cake. A gold watch. He did not want to be crawling around in someone's attic looking for a cat skeleton or a blown fuse. But duty, as they say, has a long memory. The house on Larch Street was a red brick duplex, unremarkable but well kept, shaded by a pair of ancient elms. The trees threw long, restless shadows over the porch as Rohn arrived just past 10 a.m. The neighbor, Chloe Washburn, stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, cardigan sleeves pulled over her hands. She never misses work, Chloe said, her voice sharp with worry. She feeds that cat like clockwork. But I haven't seen Pascal in days, and something's wrong in that attic. The light keeps flickering, like it's burned out or like someone's moving around up there. And there's this smell. Rohn narrowed his eyes at the upper window. A dim orange pulse flickered behind the attic curtains, intermittent, irregular. Not a lamp. Possibly a faulty bulb or a short circuit. Or something else. He tried the front door. Locked. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbed flower pots. Just silence and the faint smell of jasmine and old dust. Chloe handed him the spare key, her hands trembling. Be careful, she said. It doesn't feel right. The interior was as silent as a sealed tomb. Downstairs, orderly. The furniture was minimal, antique, and precise. A bookshelf lined with hardbound city directories, folklore encyclopedias, and books on historic preservation. A half-drunk cup of tea sat cold on a side table. A stack of handwritten index cards lay beside it, the top one labeled in ink, Old Rail Murders, 1901 to 1923. There were no signs of a break-in. No struggle. No overturned chairs. Nothing out of place except the stillness. Rohn moved slowly, deliberately, years of habit guiding his steps. Pascal was nowhere in sight. It was only when he reached the second floor that the smell hit him. Acrid. Sharp. Not quite rot, not quite mildew. Something dry and chemical, like scorched paper. It grew stronger near the attic hatch. The pull cord dangled just above the hallway landing. Rohn tugged it down. The attic ladder creaked open with a reluctant groan. He climbed. The attic was transformed. No longer just a dusty crawlspace or a place for forgotten Christmas decorations, the room had become something else entirely. The walls were papered in documents, hundreds of them, pinned edge to edge, layered and overlapping. Old property deeds. Typewritten transcripts. Police reports. Maps annotated with spidery handwriting. The scent of old paper mingled with something coppery and unsettling. In the center of the space was a massive corkboard, 6 feet wide, framed in black metal. Red string webbed across it like veins, connecting yellowed photographs, post-it notes, and index cards. At the very center, framed with deliberate care, was a single, grainy photograph. It showed a man in a 1930s police uniform, standing stiffly in front of a brick building. His cap shadowed his eyes. The badge on his chest was barely visible, but clear enough to read, number 1187. Roan stepped closer. Lines connected the photograph to addresses across Providence, some crossed out in red, others circled in blue. One address caught his eye, 301 Rose Alley. It had been the site of an unsolved triple homicide back in 1942. He'd read the file years ago. A family butchered in their home. No suspect ever named. Another line pointed to Blackstone Cemetery with the note, "Open grave, December 1936, grave never resealed." The deeper he looked, the more he realized, this wasn't obsession. It was research. Exhaustive, dangerous research. Someone had been tracing patterns through the city's darkest past, connecting the dots that no one had bothered to link. Crime spanning a century. Vanished persons. Buried scandals. But then his boot brushed against something soft beneath the attic rug. He bent down, lifted a corner of the faded tapestry, and froze. Beneath it, nestled into a small depression in the floorboards, lay a folded page of newsprint, yellowed and brittle, a 1964 copy of the Providence Journal, the edges curled with age. Inside it, 5 human teeth. They were small. Long yellowed. Still bearing fragments of old enamel. Not child's teeth, but adult molars and incisors, smooth at the roots as if long since removed. One had a silver filling. Roan stepped back slowly, the paper still open in his gloved hands. "Well," he muttered, "guess we're not waiting for cake after all." He radioed for backup. The forensic unit arrived within the hour, setting up halogen lamps in the attic, photographing every inch. Chloe had been right about the smell. The scorched paper odor was strongest near the southern wall, where a small oil lamp sat half-melted beside a scorched stack of notes. No fingerprints on the teeth. No immediate signs of blood. But the journal page they'd been wrapped in bore a strange classified ad, circled in red ink. Seeking witness to 1933 train yard fire, no police, no press. Must recall badge number 1187. Contact via box 12A. Discretion essential. Roan stared at it for a long time. Badge 1187, he said to himself. Who the hell were you? Back at the station, Roan ordered every file he could find on Providence PD personnel from the 1920s through the 1950s. It would take time. Too much time. 3 days had passed since anyone last saw Eliza Wren. Her phone was off. Her bank account untouched. Her computer, recovered from her desk at the Historical Society, revealed nothing but spreadsheets, city census records, and a heavily encrypted folder titled simply, Evidence. When asked about it, Eliza was dedicated, he said. But lately she seemed haunted. She started asking questions about deaths that were centuries old. Began requesting city records from before the fire of 1872. She said there were patterns, things people missed. She claimed someone had hidden a crime in the archives. A crime from when? The director hesitated. She said it began in 1837. And that it was still happening. That night, Roan stood in the attic alone. The forensic team had finished their work, and the room felt emptier now, less charged, but no less eerie. The red string still clung to the corkboard like veins drying in air. He picked up a loose photograph near the center. It showed a house collapsing in flame. Handwritten on the back, Dunfield Street Fire, 1948. 3 unidentified remains. The attic creaked around him, beams shifting as the wind pushed against the eaves. Somewhere in the distance, a cat yowled. Roan didn't believe in ghosts. But he believed in patterns. And this one had just begun to reveal itself. At first, while Roan told himself it was just another disappearance. A quiet woman, too many dusty files, a mind gone brittle from solitude and ghosts. Maybe she'd walked into the woods. Maybe she'd taken pills. People did strange things after years of silence. And from what he could tell, Eliza Wren had lived her life wrapped in it, layer after layer of quiet. But the attic said otherwise. The deeper Roan read, the colder the trail became, and the colder the case got, the darker it looked. Eliza's research wasn't just obsession. It was excavation. And what she'd unearthed wasn't a mystery. It was a pattern. The red circled names numbered 14. 14 women. 14 cases. Each dossier was clipped to the attic corkboard with surgical care, accompanied by newspaper clippings, witness statements, faded black and white photos, and police reports copied out by hand. Eliza had retyped some of the older documents, others she'd annotated meticulously in the margins, dates, cross-references, follow-ups. The women had little in common, at first glance. Their ages ranged from 23 to 59. Their professions spanned from laundresses to professors. Different ethnic backgrounds. Different parts of the city. Different decades. But the method, that was consistent. Each had filed a report shortly before their disappearance, small, almost forgettable crimes. A stolen purse. A slashed tire. A home break-in that left everything intact except a single missing object. In one case, a hairbrush. In another, a book from a locked drawer. Minor incidents. Barely investigated. Each time, the responding officer was the same, badge 1187. Officer Thomas Vale. Roan remembered the name vaguely. It was one that popped up now and then when the old-timers told stories. Vale had been on the force for over 4 decades. Decorated. Clean record. Retired in 1974 with full honors and a commendation for unwavering commitment to public safety. Died in 1991 of a heart attack. A badge of honor kind of guy, buried with a folded flag and a department chaplain. But something in Eliza's notes stuck with him. Not just the connections, but the effort she'd made to prove them. She hadn't guessed. She had documented. Followed property trails. Compared signatures. Traced photos through yearbooks and retirement logs. In one yellowed sheet, she'd included a side-by-side comparison of Officer Vale's signatures across a dozen incident reports spanning 3 decades. They matched, almost. But by the 1970s, the handwriting had become looser. Younger. Someone was copying his name. Someone was assuming the badge. And then, at the bottom of that same page, Eliza had scrawled a question in bold red ink. Was there ever only one Vale? The cold cases she'd mapped had been buried in a basement file, archived and forgotten, tagged with a single number, Case Series M. Roan had never heard of it. Most of the active files from that era had long been digitized or boxed into permanent record storage. The paper trail wasn't just faint, it was nearly extinct. But Eliza had pulled it back to life. He followed her chain of references through the scanned reports and uncovered the original case headers, missing persons, unsolved. Each marked with a capital M in the corner. Why the M? He murmured, flipping through them. It wasn't a classification he recognized. Not murder. Not missing. Just M. And then he saw the oldest document in the stack. A typewritten interdepartmental memo dated March 6, 1940, labeled, Re, Series M, Internal Tracking Only. Do not disseminate. Keep off. Elkin had worked part-time at the same institution where Eliza had spent the last 20 years. Her disappearance had sparked no investigation at the time. The report suggested she'd likely relocated without notice. She'd had a history of anxiety, the file said. She was unmarried. Prone to overwork. The case had been quietly closed. But Eliza had reopened it in the margins. In bold pen she'd written, Judith wasn't unstable. She was cataloging disappearances. She had the same trail I found. Same questions. Same badge number. Below that, a second note, written shakily. I found her apartment lease. She lived on Rose Alley. The same address as the 1942 unsolved murders. Coincidence is breaking down. Roan rubbed a hand over his face. It was all falling into place, and none of it felt right. The badge. The missing women. The file that wasn't supposed to exist. And now Eliza, gone the same way. He stood up and walked over to the map pinned to the attic wall. The addresses formed a curve through the northern half of the city. Old houses, mostly. Tenement buildings. Rooming houses. All now gone or gentrified. But one address stood apart, well outside city limits. A hand-drawn pin stuck out beside it. Off-grid cabin, deed under Daniel W. Cole. Purchased 1948. No transfer records. No taxes. Not listed in city property rolls. Roan's gut clenched. Daniel W. Cole was not a name associated with Officer Thomas Vale. But Eliza had found the deed. A scanned copy was folded into one of the files, purchased in cash, signed by Vale's hand, witnessed by a notary who disappeared in 1951. The cabin was deep in the woods north of Woonsocket. Unlisted. Untouched. And possibly waiting. Roan sat in his cruiser at the edge of city jurisdiction, staring at the road ahead, a narrow gravel artery vanishing into a dark forest. The sun had begun to lower, casting the world in bruise-colored light. He radioed dispatch. This is Detective Roan. I'm following up on a cold case lead. Unmarked property. No backup needed yet. I'll check in at 1800. He ended the transmission. Then he switched off the engine. Silence rushed in. He opened the glove compartment and checked the contents: flashlight, notepad, standard issue Glock. For a moment he just sat there, watching the woods breathe. The trees swayed like tall shadows stretching awake. He didn't believe in haunted places. He believed in men who buried truth in paper. And he believed Eliza Wren had found something no one was ever meant to see. He got out of the car and began to walk. Halloween dawned gray and brittle, the sky the color of old ash. A cold wind slid between the trees like breath from a deep throat. Providence was preparing for tricks and sweets, children slipping into costumes, parents checking porch lights and candy bags. Detective Lyle Roan wasn't thinking about any of that. He was standing on the edge of the woods outside Woonsocket, staring at a patch of land that hadn't been walked in decades. They found the cabin by noon. It had been swallowed by the forest, choked in ivy, its roof slumped like a broken shoulder. Moss coated the clapboard siding. The windows had long since blackened. Trees leaned toward it like sentries. If Eliza hadn't marked the location in her files, Roan doubted anyone would have ever found it again. The front door gave way with a groan, hinges crusted in rust. Inside, it smelled like mildew, rot, and something older, something left too long in darkness. The forensic team swept through slowly. Cameras flashed. Lights clicked on. Dust hung like spores in the air, dancing in shafts of weak light. Every object inside was a relic. Every surface, a stage set from a darker time. There were dresses on a rack, preserved with eerie care. 1930s tea gowns. 1950s house dresses. Silk gloves, stained and thinning. A child's hair ribbon pinned to the wall. A vanity held a dozen antique hairbrushes, each tagged with a name in faded fountain pen ink. On the far wall, above a small hearth, was the gallery. Photographs, hundreds of them. Sepia portraits. Polaroids with curled edges. Black and white snapshots, the kind you'd find in a forgotten family album. All women. None smiling. All posed like exhibits. Roan scanned the wall slowly. In the second row, half hidden behind a water-stained corner, was a woman he recognized. Judith Elkin. She wore a turtleneck. Her mouth was pressed in a hard line. Her eyes, wide, they lowered lights. And what they saw turned the quiet room into a mausoleum. Bones. Dozens. Possibly more. Scattered and broken. Some long. Some small. Jawbones and rib cages. A partial spine still curled like it had died in fear. One forensic tech stumbled back up the ladder and vomited behind the cabin. And in the far corner, half hidden under an old quilt, a human form. Pale. Still. Barely breathing. Eliza, Roan whispered. She was bound at the wrists and ankles. Duct tape covered her mouth, but loosely. It looked like it had been reapplied several times, sloppily. Her skin was marked with bruises, and her eyes fluttered as the lights hit her. Paramedics were called. The radio lit up with chatter. Roan stayed by her side as the team worked quickly, gently, lifting her from the cellar with careful hands. She blinked in the daylight, disoriented but alive. It was the first miracle of Roan's career. The kind that usually comes too late. They flew her to Miriam Hospital. Roan followed. She didn't speak for 2 days. The doctors said she'd been drugged, likely with a combination of sedatives and tranquilizers. Whoever had kept her hadn't intended to kill her. At least, not right away. She hadn't been fed properly. She was dehydrated. But she had survived. That haunted Roan more than the cellar. Someone had gone through great lengths to keep her alive. To preserve her. To continue something. On the third day, she stirred. The nurse called him in just before sunrise. Her voice was rough with disbelief. She said something, the nurse whispered. Not much. Eliza was sitting up in the hospital bed, for in her arm, her hair limp across her shoulders. Her eyes were clear but distant, as though seeing through layers of time. Roan sat down beside her. Waited. Let her gather the words. And finally, in a hoarse voice that cracked at the edges, she whispered. He had a son. It changed everything. Roan didn't know whether to be relieved or horrified. If Thomas Vale had a son, unofficial, secret, off the record, that meant the badge didn't die in 1991. It was passed down. The name, the number, the methods. Everything Eliza had uncovered wasn't just history. It was inheritance. A bloodline of silence. A legacy of vanishing women. And somewhere, out there, the sun was still watching. Still waiting. And Roan had the terrible feeling that Eliza hadn't just been researching the past. She had disturbed something that was still very much alive. The bones spoke first. It took weeks of careful testing, but the results arrived in waves, each one chipping away the myth, replacing it with something much worse, fact. The remains found in the cellar beneath the cabin were human. Female. 6 distinct DNA profiles. 6 lives. Two had names now. Judith Elkin was one. Confirmed by a lock of hair preserved in the archives, an odd, overlooked relic, until Eliza had flagged it in a note as necessary for ID if found. The second, Miriam Glasser, a 26-year-old laundress who disappeared in 1955 after filing a complaint about a man who followed her home from the bus stop. Her name had been circled in Eliza's attic in red ink. The third was likely Marina Foss, 1937, last seen leaving a church on Benefit Street. There were no dental records for the others. No relatives still alive to claim them. But Roan knew what they were: proof. Proof of murder. Proof of predation. Proof of a pattern passed down like a trade. But the twist came from the living. Forensics had dusted the attic thoroughly after Eliza's disappearance, on door handles, file drawers, the underside of her corkboard. Several usable prints came back with partial matches. The system flagged one of them. Officer Thomas Vale. Roan stared at the screen when the result came in, waiting for the catch. A clerical error. A contamination flag. Something. But the system was confident. The fingerprint was a 98.3% match with samples collected from Vale's retirement file, inked prints from his final paperwork in 1974. Impossible. He'd been dead since 1991. Unless Eliza was right. She said he had a son, Roan murmured. He pulled her notes again, scouring the margins for context. The scribbled web of theories, addresses, and name fragments all pointed back to one unsourced line. Son born 1956. Hidden through sealed records. Adopted out. Name change suspected. Not deceased. That same year, a Thomas R. Vale Jr. had been born in Providence General Hospital. The record was sealed, standard for private adoptions. But Eliza had left herself a breadcrumb, a notation referencing Form B-12A, a confidential request filed to obtain adoption records for archival research and historical clearance. She had bent rules. Maybe broke no criminal record. No parking tickets. Paid taxes on time. Kept to himself. Neighbors said he was polite, forgettable, odd but kind. Lived alone in a duplex near Pawtucket. Walked to work. Never caused a stir. The perfect ghost. But Roan saw through it now. Richard Cole wasn't just a man with secrets. He was the secret. They moved carefully. A private investigation, quiet, sealed, no leaks. The evidence had to be airtight. Surveillance was discreet. Fingerprints matched. Hair samples pulled from his trash were consistent with biological traces recovered from the attic and the cabin. Then came the clincher. A hidden camera at the archives captured him entering the restricted microfilm vault at 2:11 a.m., a time when he shouldn't have had access. He stayed for 23 minutes. When he left, he was holding something wrapped in brown cloth. The footage was grainy, but Roan could make out the edge of it. A photograph. Later analysis revealed the item was part of an original 1940s police case file. One of the case series M folders. He was cleaning his trail. Or continuing it. They arrested him on November 17, 1998, outside a Dunkin' Donuts 2 blocks from the archives. He didn't run. Didn't speak. He just raised his hands, tilted. Cole's testimony was flat, affectless. He spoke of his childhood like reciting a textbook. He said his father believed certain women deserved to vanish. That they were mouthy, difficult, ungrateful. That, correction, was a duty. He'd been taught it wasn't murder. It was service. At sentencing, the court gave victims' families time to speak. Few remained. Most had died never knowing the truth. Some had no descendants. Others couldn't face it. Then Cole spoke. His statement was brief. I didn't kill them out of hate, he said. I did it because I wanted to finish what he started. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. One juror wept openly. The judge stared at Cole like he was looking at something fossilized, ancient, and yet somehow still breathing. Cole received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He showed no remorse. Nadine's article was published 6 weeks later. Front page, above the fold. Titled, "The Ones History Tried to Erase." It named every woman Eliza had tracked. It printed Vale's badge photo. It printed the map Eliza had drawn by hand, connecting disappearances across time, geography, and indifference. But one detail was withheld. At Eliza's request, Nadine never published the location of the Vermont farmhouse. Never revealed Eliza's new name. She gave everything she had to the dead, Nadine wrote. Now the living must let her rest. Some say Eliza still writes, under aliases, submitting essays to feminist journals and obscure historical digests. Others believe she left the country entirely. Detective Lyle Rohn, now retired, occasionally receives postcards from untraceable P.O. boxes. No return address. Just photos of historical plaques. Old headstones. Forgotten names carved in stone. No message. Just memory. History remembers what it's told to remember. But there are those, quiet, stubborn, haunted, who keep the thread alive. They don't chase monsters. They resurrect the silenced. In 2001, the Rhode Island legislature passed a bill that had been sitting dormant for nearly a decade. It was designed to mandate open access to all police records related to unsolved cases older than 40 years. Prior to this, such files had been kept sealed indefinitely, often buried in basements, lost to bureaucracy, or destroyed under the guise of administrative necessity. The bill passed unanimously. The press called it Eliza's Law. Officially, it had a longer title, an act for the public right to historical inquiry of cold cases, but no one used it. Everyone knew whose name belonged on its spine. Eliza Wren never lobbied for the bill. She never contacted a lawmaker, never sat for a hearing, never offered testimony. But her work spoke louder than legislation. The Historical Society never filled her role again. Officially, it was restructured. The archive was absorbed into a broader municipal department and gutted of staff. The attic remained locked. A few junior archivists, who had trained briefly under Eliza, returned years later to find her desk untouched. The dust had returned. The tea tins were still lined in alphabetical order: chamomile, jasmine, lapsang souchong. The building itself grew quieter. Some said it had always been a mausoleum. Now, it finally admitted it. Reporters continued to try. For years after her disappearance and reappearance, journalists, true crime authors, and podcasters sent letters. A few even visited Vermont towns, knocking on doors of old houses and asking about a woman with silver hair and distant eyes. No one found her. Nadine Chaudhry, the only journalist Eliza had ever spoken to, never revealed anything more than what she'd printed. She moved on to other cases, smaller ones, quieter ones, but always carried that manila folder with her. Once, during a panel on investigative journalism, someone asked what Eliza had been like in person. Nadine paused. She didn't walk like someone who'd been rescued, she said. She walked like someone who'd come back from the grave and didn't quite trust the ground anymore. But the biggest mystery remained. Why the cabin? Why did Eliza go alone? Why didn't she call Detective Rohn, or the authorities, or anyone at all? Why risk her life after doing all the work of uncovering the truth? No one ever knew. No one ever would. Rohn, for all his hard-boiled instincts and years of casework, never got an answer. He retired quietly, remarried once, and kept a photograph of Eliza's corkboard on the wall of his study, a copy, blurred slightly from overexposure. He'd stare at it for hours some nights, letting the red strings pull his thoughts in different directions. One night, he told his wife the thing he never said on the record. "I think she wanted to disappear. Not from us, from him. She needed to see where it ended. And when she got there, she almost didn't make it back. And then there were the 10 days. The time Eliza spent in that root cellar. Drugged. Bound. Forgotten by everyone except her captor. She never spoke of it. Doctors said her vitals were stabilized within days. Physically, she would heal. Psychologically, no one could say. They tried therapy, support groups, trauma specialists. She attended one session. Never returned. The only time she even acknowledged that period, it was in a single line during her interview with Nadine. I learned that there are worse things than death. And worse men than monsters. Some mysteries don't unravel. They sit at the center of a story like a knot, tight, dense, and deliberate. Eliza carried that knot with her. Not to hide it. Not to protect anyone. But because no one else could bear it. That silence was hers. Eliza's Law has since opened more than 900 cold case records. University students now study the archival traces of the vanishing women, a term coined in a 2010 thesis that credits Eliza as a rogue scholar who made history breathe again. And in 2023, a final burial took place. The last set of remains from the cabin, formerly listed as Jane Doe No. 5, was confirmed via DNA and laid to rest in Swan Point Cemetery under a new headstone. Esther A. Curran, 1919 to 1938. Remembered. Named. Known. But not all questions get answers. Some endings are earned. Some are chosen. And some, like Eliza herself, are not lost. Just no longer waiting to be found. In the tangled heart of downtown Los Angeles, where skyscrapers cast long shadows over cracked sidewalks and neon lights blur into smog, stood a building with a name that made even hardened city dwellers uneasy, the Cecil Hotel. Built in 1924, the Cecil was once the jewel of Main Street, a grand, towering edifice of ambition and promise. Its marble lobby gleamed with Art Deco flair, its windows polished and wide to let in the glow of the California sun. Designed to cater to businessmen, European tourists, and wealthier cross-country travelers, the hotel was a reflection of the city's golden dreams during the Roaring Twenties. For a time, it lived up to its potential. Guests arrived in sleek Packards and Hudsons, greeted by uniformed doormen, their leather suitcases trundled up into suites that promised rest, leisure, and a view of a city rising. But Los Angeles was a city that evolved faster than most. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression cast its long, clawing shadow over the country, and over the Cecil. As businesses shuttered and fortunes vanished overnight, the hotel's clientele changed. Rooms once graced by businessmen and artists now offered a place to sleep for drifters, the desperate, and the destitute. Downtown LA, once a glamorous core, began to decay into a gritty underbelly. The Cecil, caught in the gravity of its surroundings, began its slow descent. Decade by decade, the hotel transformed, not through remodeling, but through attrition. Paint peeled, elevators groaned, and the once grand lobby collected more shadows than guests. It didn't take long before the Cecil became synonymous not with glamour but with tragedy. It had absorbed the trauma of the streets surrounding it. Skid Row, just blocks away, had swollen into a labyrinth of tents, addiction, and invisible suffering. The hotel's towering frame loomed over the city like a forgotten sentinel, a relic of grandeur cursed to witness decline. By the late 20th century, the Cecil was no longer just another rundown hotel, it had become legend. A haunted one. There were whispers, rumors that pulsed beneath the surface like a second heartbeat. They spoke of suicides, overdoses, and violent outbursts. Bodies discovered in rooms days after death. Strangers who had vanished inside without a trace. Over the decades, the hotel's roster of guests included not only the poor and transient, but the disturbed, the dangerous, and, in a few shocking cases, the monstrous. One such guest was Richard Ramirez, later dubbed the Night Stalker. In the summer of 1985, during his spree of brutal home invasions and murders across California, Ramirez reportedly found sanctuary within the Cecil. Locals say he would return to the hotel in blood-stained clothes, slipping through the lobby unnoticed, unchallenged. His room, a dingy upper-floor space without air conditioning, became a lair. But Ramirez wasn't the only predator to haunt the hotel. In the early 1990s, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger also stayed there. He claimed to be a reformed man, a writer on a journalistic mission to explore the American justice system. In truth, he had resumed killing. He stalked the very streets the Cecil overlooked, targeting sex workers and strangling them with their own bras, his method eerily similar to his earlier murders in Europe. But it wasn't just the high-profile killers that marked the Cecil's legacy. It was the volume, the sheer, disturbing number, of deaths that occurred there. Suicides became almost commonplace. One woman leapt from a ninth-floor window and killed a pedestrian below. Another man slashed his own throat in a bathtub. Death, like a disease, seeped into the wallpaper and flooring, unseen but ever-present. Some say the Cecil is cursed. Others say it simply became a reflection of its environment, absorbing the pain, decay, and mental illness that ran unchecked through the city's poorest district. Whatever the reason, the hotel had become a place of whispers and shadows, avoided by locals and cautiously documented by urban legends websites and true crime enthusiasts. So when Elisa Lam, a bright-eyed, 21-year-old university student from Vancouver, British Columbia, arrived at the Cecil in January of 2013, her presence barely registered. She came alone, carrying only 2 small bags and a moleskine notebook filled with journal entries and reading lists. Her itinerary was typical for a young tourist. She wanted to explore the West Coast, meet new people, visit bookstores, cafes, and museums. Her Tumblr blog, Modern Day Diary, was filled with whimsical thoughts, snippets of poetry, and reflections on depression and anxiety. She was articulate and introspective, a daughter of Chinese immigrants who worked tirelessly to build a life for their daughters in Canada. Elisa was close to her family. She messaged her parents every day. Her posts painted a portrait of a young woman struggling with mental health, but trying. Trying so hard. She had begun her journey in San Diego and moved north to Los Angeles. She had chosen the Cecil Hotel for the same reason many backpackers and budget travelers did: it was cheap. The website advertised affordable lodging downtown, just minutes from public transit, museums, and tourist landmarks. What it didn't advertise were the stains in the carpet, the flickering lights, or the otherworldly stillness that crept in once the sun went down. Elisa was initially assigned to a shared room on the hotel's 5th floor, part of the Stay on Main rebranding effort, a futile attempt to separate the Cecil's past from its present. That floor was supposed to be different. Modern. Safer. But even that section couldn't erase the building's essence. Something lingered in the halls, a weight in the air, a silence that felt like it listened. Within days of her arrival, her roommates asked for her to be moved. According to later reports, Elisa's behavior had become odd. She left notes on the beds warning others to go away, and locked the door multiple times without explanation. She would disappear for hours and return agitated. Some said she talked to herself. Some said she was afraid. Whatever the truth, she was eventually moved to a room of her own. And then, on January 31st, Elisa vanished. She was last seen on surveillance footage, grainy, black and white, time-stamped and silent, inside the hotel's elevator. The footage would later become infamous, studied and dissected by millions around the world. In it, Elisa appears anxious. She steps in and out of the elevator repeatedly. She presses every button in a column. She peeks around the corner into the hallway, as though checking for someone. At one point, she hides in the corner, then makes a series of bizarre hand gestures, as though speaking to someone invisible. Then she walks away. The elevator doors remain open, unmoving. And just like that, she's gone. Days passed. Her parents, worried when she didn't check in, called the LAPD. Flyers were posted. Volunteers scoured the streets. Detectives questioned guests and hotel staff. The building was searched from basement to rooftop, but Elisa had vanished as if swallowed whole. Only weeks later, after guests began to complain about the water, of low pressure, of odd taste and color, did hotel maintenance climb to the roof to check the tanks. Inside one of them, floating face up, naked, was Elisa Lamb. The rooftop was supposed to be off limits. The door was locked and alarmed. The water tank's opening was small, heavy to lift. There was no ladder inside. The discovery deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. How had she gotten up there? How had she gotten inside? Was she running from someone? Or something? The story exploded across media outlets. Some blamed the hotel's history. Others saw evidence of foul play. Paranormal investigators claimed supernatural influence. Skeptics pointed to her known mental health struggles. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and suggested it was a tragic accident exacerbated by psychosis. But nothing about the case felt ordinary. Not the footage. Not the location. Not the history that wrapped around the building like a second skin. The Cecil Hotel had claimed another story, another soul, and left behind only confusion in its wake. Elisa Lamb had stepped into its haunted halls with hope, curiosity, and the same sense of wanderlust so many young travelers carry. She left behind a mystery that would ripple across the internet, spawn documentaries, theories, and forums. And in the shadows of downtown Los Angeles, the Cecil stood still, silent, watching, its legacy sealed once more in death. Elisa Lamb was, in many ways, like countless other young women of her generation, smart, curious, and caught between the wide-open promise of the world and the invisible weight she carried within. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, and a writer, raised in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, where the mountains stood as silent witnesses to her youth. Born on April 30, 1991, Elisa was the first child of David and Yina Lam, immigrants from Hong Kong who had crossed oceans to find a better life in Canada. Her parents had opened a restaurant, pouring their time and savings into its survival. They worked hard, tirelessly, and in many ways, Elisa was the realization of their hopes. She was the bridge between two worlds, fluent in English and Cantonese. She moved between her family's Chinese cultural roots and the Western ideals of independence and self-expression with a quiet grace. But Elisa's mind was rarely still. She read voraciously, thought deeply, and saw the world through a kaleidoscope of emotion. At the University of British Columbia, she studied in fits and starts, not always able to keep up with the rhythm of campus life. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and the symptoms, highs that danced too close to mania, lows that dipped into deep, suffocating depression, were a constant negotiation. There were days when getting out of bed felt impossible, and others when her thoughts came in such rapid torrents that sleep was a foreign concept. Still, she tried. Always, she tried. She turned to writing as a lifeline, pouring her inner world onto the internet in a blog titled Ether Fields. Her entries read like a collage of moods, some poetic, some raw, some darkly humorous. She reflected on fashion trends, pop culture, loneliness, and love. She confessed to feeling like an outsider, someone adrift between identities, between moods, between destinations. But she was self-aware, often sharper about her struggles than the people around her were about their own. And her voice, unfiltered, articulate, wounded, and wise, resonated with the handful of strangers who stumbled across her posts. As 2013 approached, Elisa made a resolution. She would travel. It wasn't just about sightseeing. This was something deeper. A search. A challenge to herself. She wanted to step outside the tight orbit of her familiar world. Her illness had often made her feel limited, her life carefully scheduled around medications, therapy appointments, and rest. But travel offered something else: freedom. Possibility. A test of her own resilience. Her parents, naturally, worried. A solo trip was a bold move, especially for someone managing a mental health condition. But Elisa reassured them. She would be careful. She would check in every day. She would take her medication. And besides, this was something she needed to do, not just for herself, but for her own sense of becoming. And so, in late January, with her prescription medications packed neatly in her bag and a digital camera in hand, Elisa boarded a southbound bus. Her plan was to make her way down the West Coast: San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, each city a chapter in a story she hadn't yet written. She began in San Diego, where the Pacific shimmered under clear skies and the air was sweet with the scent of eucalyptus. She went to the zoo and posted pictures of koalas and panda bears. Her blog showed a woman engaged with the world, curious, lively, sometimes tired, but determined. She took selfies in front of sculptures and storefronts, wrote about her longing to connect with others, to shake the feeling of isolation that sometimes clung to her like a second skin. On January 26, she arrived in Los Angeles. It was a sprawling city that offered both wonder and contradiction. Elisa had imagined palm trees, creative energy, a sense of discovery. What she found was something else entirely. Downtown Los Angeles was not the Hollywood dreamscape many travelers expected. It was rougher, more complex. Sidewalks gave way to tents and shelters, and the juxtaposition of wealth and poverty was impossible to ignore. Still, she pressed on, checking into the Cecil Hotel that afternoon. The decision to stay at the Cecil likely came down to cost. The hotel's online listings under its rebranded name, Stay on Main, offered affordable rates for students and backpackers. It promised free Wi-Fi, daily housekeeping, and a central location. The photos showed modern rooms with fresh paint and minimalist decor. What it didn't show was the building's past, or the fact that the rebranding was little more than a cosmetic layer on top of decades of decay. Elisa was assigned to a shared room on the 5th floor. For a few days, things seemed fine. She explored the neighborhood, browsed local bookstores, and likely wandered through the eclectic chaos of the fashion district. She wrote blog posts about her thoughts and observations, often candid about her emotional state. But then something shifted. Her roommates complained to the staff. They said Elisa was behaving strangely, locking them out, taping notes to their belongings with cryptic messages. It was unclear what exactly had changed, but it was enough that the hotel moved her to a private room on January 28. No one knows precisely what Elisa was thinking during those final days. Her online activity began to dwindle. She made a few posts, some cryptic, others melancholic. On January 30th, she visited the Last Bookstore, a local LA landmark. A photograph captured her standing by a stack of books, dressed in a red hoodie, smiling faintly. It would be the last known image of her alive, taken by the store's owner, who later recalled that she was quiet but friendly, nothing unusual. And then came January 31st. Elisa didn't call home that day. For most young adults, a missed check-in wouldn't cause immediate concern. But Elisa had been diligent, calling her parents daily. She knew they worried about her. They trusted her, but cautiously. She had promised to keep them informed. So when the call didn't come, her parents noticed. By February 1st, panic had set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. Officers visited the Cecil and began a preliminary investigation. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, Elisa's smiling face, her age, height, last seen location. Her parents, frantic, flew in from Vancouver to aid the search. They spoke at press conferences, urging anyone with information to come forward. They pleaded in Cantonese and English, voices cracking with emotion. Meanwhile, the LAPD searched the hotel from bottom to top. They checked the lobby, her room, common areas, hallways. They interviewed staff and guests. But the building was vast, 15 floors, nearly 700 rooms, a maze of staircases, old plumbing, and forgotten passageways. And Elisa, it seemed, had vanished into thin air. The investigators were baffled. Her belongings were still in her room. Her laptop. Her wallet. Her medication. Nothing had been taken. There were no signs of a struggle. No witnesses reported seeing her leave. She was simply gone. Outside the hotel, the city pulsed on. Tourists drifted along the Walk of Fame. Studio tours rolled on. The sun set each day behind the skyline, unaware that a young woman had disappeared beneath its glow. But inside the Cecil, tension was rising. Hotel guests began complaining of strange water. Some said it tasted odd. Others described a dark tint, a foul smell. The pressure dropped noticeably. One couple reported taking a shower only to be hit with what looked like black sludge. It would take nearly 3 weeks for the maintenance staff to climb onto the roof and check the water tanks. Until then, all anyone could do was search and speculate. Internet forums lit up. Reddit threads began theorizing everything from abduction to mental breakdown to paranormal interference. True crime enthusiasts began digging into the Cecil's past. Journalists looked into Elisa's blog. And slowly, the disappearance took on a life of its own. She was no longer just a missing person. She was a mystery. A question. A ghost haunting the modern mind. The story of Elisa Lam, still unfinished, hovered like fog over downtown Los Angeles, thickening with every passing hour. The footage was less than 4 minutes long. On February 13, 2013, 13 days after Elisa Lam was last seen, the Los Angeles Police Department made a decision that would forever change the trajectory of her case. With few leads, no witnesses, and a growing sense of public urgency, they released a surveillance video to the public, asking for help identifying Elisa's last known movements. It was pulled from a security camera mounted inside one of the Cecil Hotel's aging elevators, time-stamped January 31st, the day Elisa vanished. There was no warning for what people were about to see. The video was uploaded to YouTube, and within hours, it was shared across social media, news outlets, forums, and blogs. People around the world watched it in disbelief. They watched it again. And again. And again. Every frame felt like a clue. Every movement, a question. The footage begins simply enough. The elevator doors slide open, and Elisa steps inside. She is wearing a red hoodie over a gray t-shirt and black shorts. Her dark hair is parted in the middle, hanging in soft waves around her face. She looks like any ordinary young woman, until she doesn't. Elisa leans forward, her finger pressing a sequence of buttons on the control panel, multiple floors, one after the other, as though unsure where to go or in a hurry to go everywhere at once. Then she retreats to the back corner of the elevator and waits. But the doors don't close. She steps forward, tentatively, peeking her head into the hallway as if looking for someone, perhaps to see if she is being followed. She ducks back inside, pressing herself against the wall, then steps out again. Her head swivels quickly from side to side. Then she hides. She flattens herself against the wall near the control panel, out of view of anyone passing by. Her body language is anxious, furtive, as though she is playing a game of hide-and-seek or trying desperately to avoid being seen. But there is no one else in the video. What comes next is what ignited the wildfire of public speculation. Elisa steps out of the elevator and begins to move her hands in a strange, almost ritualistic way. She lifts them in slow, exaggerated motions, bending her fingers, pushing the air, almost as if she's speaking with her hands to someone invisible. The gestures are not random. They are deliberate, slow, like pantomime. Some viewers described it as talking to a ghost. Others saw it as a cry for help. And then, she walks out of frame. The elevator doors, which had remained inexplicably open for over 2 minutes, finally close, and open again. And again. The elevator begins moving only after she has gone, stopping on floor after floor, opening to empty hallways. End of video. There was no scream. No visible assailant. No blood. No sound. Just Elisa's movements, distorted slightly by the lens, framed in cold fluorescence, played on loop across millions of screens around the globe. Theories erupted like brush fires. By the next morning, the phrase, "Elisa Lam elevator video," was trending worldwide. Reddit threads sprang up by the dozen, dissecting the footage frame by frame. YouTube creators posted reaction videos and breakdowns. Paranormal forums lit up with speculation. TikTokers would later recreate her gestures with eerie precision, turning her final moments into internet folklore. But at the core of it all, one question repeated again and again: what happened to her? Some viewers were convinced Elisa was being followed, that she had entered the elevator trying to escape someone. They speculated about a stalker, a hotel employee, a murderer lying just out of view. The fact that she pressed multiple buttons and tried to hide lent credibility to that theory. Why else would she act so erratically? Why else would she keep glancing over her shoulder? Others leaned toward the supernatural. The Cecil Hotel's history was no secret by now, especially not online. True crime sleuths had already connected the dots. This was the same hotel where Richard Ramirez had lived during his Night Stalker rampage. Where suicides occurred with disturbing frequency. Where women had jumped, or been pushed, from windows, where strange deaths piled up like forgotten stories. Elisa's strange hand movements, the inexplicable elevator behavior, and her final disappearance all seemed to echo something unexplainable. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators saw signs of possession, of otherworldly influence. They pointed to urban legends, to haunted architecture, to thin places where the veil between dimensions supposedly breaks. Then came a more grounded, though no less haunting, explanation: a psychological break. Elisa's own blog had documented her struggles with bipolar disorder. She had written candidly about her experience with depressive episodes and hypomania. Medical professionals and mental health advocates suggested the footage showed signs of acute psychosis, a possible result of her condition if she had stopped taking her medication or suffered a chemical imbalance. Her behavior in the video, rapid mood shifts, paranoia, hallucinatory interaction, could have been the result of a manic or psychotic episode. Some viewers found this the most plausible theory. Others dismissed it, arguing that it didn't account for her physical disappearance or the eventual location of her body. There was, after all, a question no theory could comfortably answer. How did Elisa Lam end up dead in a locked, sealed water tank on the hotel's roof? The viral spread of the video transformed Elisa from a missing person to a modern myth. Online communities gave her nicknames: the girl in the elevator, the ghost of the Cecil, Red Hoodie Girl. They created fan art, tribute videos, even ghost stories that blurred fact and fiction. The video became a cultural artifact, part horror movie, part true crime, part internet legend. But at the center of the hysteria was a real woman, a daughter, a friend, someone whose life had been reduced to a series of 4 minutes and a series of unanswered questions. Her family, still in Los Angeles, watched as their daughter's final recorded moments were devoured by the world. While they grieved and searched for answers, strangers across continents turned her final moments into conspiracy theories, YouTube content, Reddit karma, and clickbait headlines. Elisa's disappearance was no longer just a case. It was an obsession. People began calling the hotel. Tourists visited the Cecil to ride the very elevator she used. Ghost hunters trespassed in the hallways at night. Some even climbed the fire escapes in an attempt to reach the rooftop, retracing what they imagined might have been Elisa's final steps. The Cecil Hotel was once again infamous, not for its history, but for something current. The past had caught up with the present, and the result was a digital seance on a global scale. As February unfolded, police remained tight-lipped. They urged the public not to draw conclusions. But the damage, or transformation, was already done. The case had gone viral, and with that, it had slipped from the hands of law enforcement into the hands of the internet, where theories spiraled out of control. Even now, over a decade later, people still point to that elevator footage as one of the most unsettling pieces of real-life mystery ever captured on tape. Its grainy, low-resolution texture only heightens its strangeness. Its silence screams louder than any sound could. In the end, the video revealed everything and nothing. It showed Elisa's final confirmed movements. It showed her alive. Anxious. Afraid. But it didn't show what happened next. And so, a single piece of surveillance footage became a window into a tragedy that no one could fully explain. It became a mirror for the fears, curiosities, and obsessions of a digital world desperate for answers, and addicted to mystery. Elisa Lam, a woman searching for freedom and discovery, had become a riddle buried in code and pixels. And the Cecil Hotel, once again, had become the stage for a story that didn't seem real, except that it was. For 19 days, Elisa Lam was missing. In the space of those 19 days, Los Angeles turned cold and strange. A city that thrived on motion began to pause and look inward, caught in the grip of a growing enigma. Downtown life continued, buses roared down South Main Street, vendors opened their shops, and the Cecil Hotel kept accepting guests. But an unease hung over the building like smog. Inside the hotel, guests were beginning to notice something peculiar, something wrong. First came the complaints. The water pressure had dropped. Faucets sputtered. Showers dripped feebly. And when the water did come, it ran dark, like rust or ink, before clearing. Some guests said it tasted metallic. Others said it smelled foul, like sewage or rot. One British tourist reported brushing her teeth only to gag at the strange aftertaste. A couple from Hong Kong described the water as black and oily. It wasn't just discolored, it was disturbing. Still, the hotel management offered only apologies. Downtown LA was old, they said. Plumbing issues happened. Maintenance would be sent up. The Cecil Hotel had weathered worse. But behind the front desk, the whispers had started. Some staff members had heard the police were still searching the hotel. Guests had asked about the missing girl. Flyers with Elisa Lam's photo were still pinned near the elevator. And then there was the elevator footage, released just 6 days earlier. That chilling, grainy video had gone viral, and now tourists were arriving because of it. Something was happening. Something more than broken plumbing. On the morning of February 19, 2013, a hotel maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez climbed up to the rooftop. It was routine, in theory. Lopez had been told to check the water tanks, for large, industrial cylinders positioned on a platform above the roof, supplying water to guest rooms, the kitchen, and the lobby. The tanks were sealed and heavy-lidded, accessed only by ladder. In theory, they were secure. In theory, no one should have been near them. Lopez climbed carefully. The morning air was sharp with haze. He reached the platform and approached the first tank, the one closest to the front of the building. He pulled himself up, balanced on the narrow ledge, and gripped the lid. It was heavier than expected. With effort, he pushed it open, and froze. Inside the dark water, barely visible at first, floated the body of a young woman. She was naked. Face up. Her skin had turned pale from the cold water, her hair fanned out around her like seaweed. There were no immediate signs of injury. Just stillness. Her eyes were open. It was Elisa Lam. News spread fast, first among hotel staff, then to the police, then to the world. By midday, yellow police tape ringed the building. Fire trucks, ambulances, and forensics vans parked haphazardly along South Main. Helicopters circled overhead. News crews scrambled to get footage. Tourists and pedestrians gawked from behind barricades, unsure whether they were witnessing a crime scene or a movie shoot. But this was no fiction. The girl who had smiled for the camera in the last bookstore. The girl in the elevator. The daughter who never called home. She had been here the whole time, floating above everyone. Literally inside the hotel's drinking water. Her body was recovered only after the tank was drained and cut open from the side. The access hatch was too narrow to remove her otherwise. Inside the tank, investigators found her clothes, soaked and tangled at the bottom, the red hoodie, t-shirt, shorts, and underwear she'd been wearing in the elevator footage. Her room key and watch were also found, dropped among the sludge and sediment. But there was something deeply strange about the logistics. The tanks were 8 feet tall, with heavy metal lids. They had no internal ladders. The hotel roof itself was not accessible to guests, at least not easily. The stairway was locked, and a security alarm was supposed to trigger if someone opened the door without authorization. Yet Elisa had somehow reached the roof, climbed onto the tank platform, removed the lid, and entered the water, all on her own. And if not on her own, then how? The autopsy report, released several months later, only deepened the confusion. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, with Elisa's bipolar disorder cited as a significant contributing factor. There were no signs of trauma, no evidence of sexual assault, and no illegal drugs found in her system. Toxicology showed trace amounts of her prescribed medications, likely antidepressants and mood stabilizers, but inconsistencies raised eyebrows. Some levels were lower than expected. Was she skipping doses? Had she stopped her medication during her trip? If so, it could have triggered a psychotic episode, paranoia, hallucinations, erratic behavior. The coroner suggested this could explain her disoriented state in the elevator footage, as well as her actions on the roof. But others weren't so sure. Critics pointed to how difficult it would have been for anyone, let alone a young woman in a state of distress, to access the roof without triggering alarms, scale the tank, open the lid, undress, and willingly climb inside. The tanks were not designed for access. There were no footprints on the dusty rooftop. The lid, when found, was closed, though Lopez said he had to open it to discover her. Had someone closed it after her? Was she placed there? Or had the chaos of the moment, media confusion, changing witness statements, simply distorted the facts? The inconsistencies became fuel for an inferno of theories. Online, the reaction was explosive. Redditors dissected the autopsy report line by line, highlighting phrases like submersion interval unknown and manner of death, undetermined before additional testing. YouTubers posted elaborate breakdowns, mapping Elisa's probable path through the hotel. Paranormal investigators offered ghostly interpretations, claiming Elisa had been lured to the roof by a malevolent force. Even darker ideas circulated. Had Elisa met someone at the hotel? A stranger? An employee? Was there something sinister about the guests on her floor? Some pointed out that serial killer Jack Unterweger had once stayed at the Cecil. Was there a copycat? Then came the most infamous theory, that Elisa was the victim of something planned, a cover-up. Some noted that Elisa's death bore eerie similarities to a 1990s horror film, Dark Water, in which a young girl dies in a rooftop water tank, causing black water to seep into the building below. Others noticed an eerie coincidence with a tuberculosis test being conducted in downtown LA around the same time, named LAM Elisa. To some, it was all coincidence. To others, evidence. The LAPD, for their part, issued no further statements. The case was closed. They found no signs of foul play. They found no one to charge. But for Elisa Lam's family, and for millions who followed the story, it was far from over. Back in Vancouver, the Lam family grieved in private. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the hotel, claiming negligence in security and safety measures. Their daughter, they argued, should never have been able to access the roof. The case was eventually dismissed, but the trauma remained. They never spoke publicly of the elevator footage. They never engaged with the conspiracy theories. What the world had turned into spectacle, they bore as sorrow. To them, Elisa was not a ghost, a mystery, or a meme. She was a daughter who never came home. And yet the questions remain. Why was the elevator malfunctioning in the footage? How did Elisa reach the roof undetected? Why was the hatch reportedly closed if she entered on her own? Why did her behavior oscillate so wildly, between fearful and calm, rational and erratic? No theory explains it all. The official explanation, accidental death, exacerbated by bipolar disorder, is plausible. But it leaves emotional gaps. How did she feel in those final moments? Was she scared? Confused? Was she aware of what she was doing? Did she intend it? Or was she running from something we'll never see? In the end, the truth may be less dramatic than the theories, but no less tragic. Elisa Lam was 21 years old. She had dreams of discovering the world, finding herself, and living on her terms. But something, illness, fear, chaos, or something else, led her to the rooftop of one of Los Angeles's most haunted buildings. And there, in the quiet of a cold steel tank, her story ended. Or, more accurately, her life ended. Her story still echoes. Elisa Lam was found in a place she never should have been. That fact alone, simple, stubborn, has haunted investigators, family, theorists, and casual readers of her story for over a decade. In the weeks following the discovery of her body, attention turned sharply toward a single, critical question. How did Elisa get to the roof? The answer, like nearly everything in this case, only seemed to generate more questions. The roof of the Cecil Hotel wasn't designed for guests. There were two primary routes to the top. One was an internal staircase, locked and alarmed, accessible only with a staff keycard. The other was an external fire escape, a steel framework clinging to the building's side, accessible through windows, some of which were difficult to open or located in locked areas. If Elisa had taken the internal stairwell, the alarm system should have sounded, a high-pitched, echoing tone audible across several floors. No such alarm was reported. And if she had used the fire escape, how had she accessed the window without being seen, heard, or leaving signs of a forced exit? Investigators tested both paths. Police confirmed that if someone had exited the stairwell through the rooftop door without a key, an alarm would have sounded. But there were no records of staff hearing it. No logs. No eyewitnesses. Nothing in the surveillance footage from the hallway showed Elisa heading toward the stairwell, and no cameras were stationed on the stairs themselves. The fire escape was more plausible, but deeply troubling. It required exiting through a window, climbing onto the escape, and scaling several stories up a narrow, rusted metal ladder. The final stretch, from the roof's edge to the tank platform, demanded careful footing across a ledge or pipe system. There were no railings. No safety barriers. It was possible, yes. But plausible? Would a young woman in an altered state, scared, manic, or confused, choose this route? Would she have had the strength and focus to climb the tank itself, open the lid, which weighed more than 20 pounds, undress, and lower herself in? Or had someone led her there? Someone with knowledge of the hotel's access points. Someone who knew how to avoid the cameras. Much of what haunts Elisa Lam's case is not what we see, but what we don't. There was no footage of her leaving the building. There was no footage of her climbing the stairs, accessing the roof, or entering restricted areas. The elevator footage, released by LAPD on February 13th, remains the last known visual record of Elisa Lam alive. It's chilling not just for her strange behavior, but because it ends abruptly, without resolution. In a hotel riddled with cameras, the absence of evidence became its own mystery. Critics pointed out that no camera footage was ever released showing the stairwell or other hallways beyond the elevator. Why not? Was there nothing there? Or was something being withheld? Online sleuths, fueled by the void, speculated wildly. Had someone followed her into the elevator, someone who stayed just out of frame? Was she hiding from someone? Was her behavior a silent cry for help, or the effects of a manic or psychotic episode brought on by her bipolar disorder? Or had the video itself been edited, cut, slowed, or manipulated to obscure the truth? Some claimed the timestamp in the footage jumped. Others said frames were missing. Experts debated it on forums and video essays for years. Even if the edits were innocent, perhaps redacted by police for privacy, the damage had been done. Where there are gaps, stories grow. And Elisa's story was fertile ground for myth. Mental illness or murder? The simplest explanation, and the one offered by the coroner's office, is this: Elisa Lam was experiencing a mental health crisis. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. Her blog posts, archived long before her death, document her struggles with mood swings, insomnia, isolation, and the toll of psychiatric medications. At times she was reflective and optimistic. At others, she seemed overwhelmed and afraid. In the days before her disappearance, hotel staff reportedly moved her from a shared room to a private one after complaints from roommates about her behavior. Though this incident remains vague, it hints that Elisa may have been in an unstable state. Toxicology reports found only traces of her prescribed medications in her system, suggesting non-compliance with her treatment. Missing doses or abrupt changes in medication can be disastrous for someone with bipolar disorder, especially if triggered by the stress of solo travel. Under this lens, her elevator behavior is not mysterious, it's tragic. A young woman, frightened and disoriented, trying to navigate an unfamiliar world while spiraling out of control. Her rooftop journey could have been impulsive, driven by hallucination, fear, or symbolic thinking. She might have removed her clothes because she felt hot, a symptom of hypothermia or psychosis. She may have believed the tank held something she needed: safety, water, meaning. But even this theory has holes. If she was experiencing a manic or psychotic episode severe enough to lead her to the rooftop and into the tank, how did she manage such a complex physical feat? Why were there no outward signs of struggle, no injuries from the climb or fall? Why, in her confusion, did she leave behind no trace? And how did she replace the heavy tank lid behind her, if she truly went in alone? The theories multiply. In the vacuum of certainty, the internet did what it always does: it created its own logic. Dozens of theories emerged, some plausible, others fantastical. Foul play: Elisa was murdered and her death staged to look like an accident. The hotel, fearing liability, cooperated in a cover-up. Stalker theory: someone followed Elisa during her travels, someone she met online or at the hotel. The elevator game: a viral urban legend claimed that by pressing buttons in a certain sequence, one could open a portal to another dimension. Some said Elisa had played it, and gotten stuck. Paranormal explanation: ghosts, demons, cursed spirits from the hotel's violent past had possessed or lured Elisa to her death. Government experimentation: Elisa's erratic behavior, strange death, and the tuberculosis outbreak, see below, were part of a test or population control effort. Simulation hypothesis: some posited that we live in a computer simulation, and that Elisa's death was a glitch in the matrix, symbolized by the elevator's malfunctioning behavior. Each theory had its adherents, and each eroded the boundary between speculation and reality. Of all the eerie coincidences surrounding Elisa Lam's death, one stood out above the rest. In early 2013, shortly before and after Elisa's body was found, an outbreak of tuberculosis swept through Skid Row, a poverty-stricken district just blocks from the Cecil Hotel. Health officials deployed teams to conduct mass testing and containment. The name of the rapid diagnostic test used to detect TB? ELISA. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's real. ELISA stands for lipoarabinominine enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, a technical term combining a TB biomarker, LAM, with a common immunology technique, ELISA. Scientists had been using the test for years. But now, in the exact location of Elisa's death, during the same week of her disappearance, it surfaced with uncanny relevance. To some, this was just an unfortunate coincidence, nothing more than linguistic irony. To others, it was a breadcrumb. Proof of something orchestrated. Elisa was involved in something bigger, whether she knew it or not. The conspiracy ballooned from there. Was Elisa a test subject? Was she silenced for witnessing something she shouldn't have? Was the ELISA test being secretly deployed in a biological experiment on the homeless? Was the Cecil Hotel being used as a vector or cover-up site? These ideas may sound outlandish, but in the echo chamber of the internet, where facts and fear mix freely, they gain traction. Suddenly, Elisa wasn't just a student on a tragic solo journey. She was a symbol. A cipher. A case. As the years passed, Elisa Lam's story took on a second life. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail. Theories shifted and mutated like viruses, infecting new minds. The Cecil Hotel, long considered cursed or haunted, became the centerpiece of a cultural obsession with dark tourism. The Netflix documentary Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel brought renewed attention in 2021. It attempted to bridge the divide between fact and fiction, highlighting the case's complex intersection of mental health, media frenzy, and historical context. But even that documentary, at times, strayed into sensationalism. What remained lost, amid the noise, was Elisa herself. She was not an experiment. Not a meme. Not a ghost. She was a young woman, vulnerable and vibrant, struggling to understand herself in a world that offered few safe places. Her death may have been an accident, or the result of mental illness, or something more. But it was real. It was human. And it hurt. So how did she get to the rooftop? Maybe she found an open window and climbed, desperate and delusional, chasing some vision only she could see. Maybe she was helped by someone who left no trace. Maybe she didn't die alone. Or maybe the truth is this: the story of Elisa Lam defies neat answers. And that's why we can't let it go. It touches something primal, the fear of being misunderstood, the fragility of the mind, the terror of vanishing without explanation. It's the kind of story that lives in the quiet space between fact and faith, between what we can explain and what we can't. The rooftop was locked. But she got there anyway. And that fact, unmoving, unresolved, sits at the heart of a mystery that may never be solved. The story of Elisa Lam didn't end with her discovery in the rooftop water tank. It didn't end with the coroner's report, the internet theories, or the camera footage played on loop. Instead, her story took on a life of its own, a ripple in the digital age, a modern myth woven from tragedy, speculation, and the aching need to find meaning in something inexplicable. Years passed. But the questions never did. In 2021, the release of Netflix's Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel reignited the conversation, reopened old wounds, reframed the mystery, and reminded a global audience of a story they had not forgotten. The documentary sought to balance narratives. It gave voice to hotel employees, internet sleuths, journalists, and psychologists. It reminded viewers that Elisa Lam was not just a headline, but a person. A daughter. A student. A young woman navigating the instability of mental illness while reaching for independence and self-discovery. But it also reignited something darker. Theories resurfaced. The elevator video was dissected once more. The armchair detectives returned, some emboldened by the platform, others humbled by the weight of the story. Many questioned whether media attention, social and otherwise, had gone too far. Whether fascination had become exploitation. What began as concern had morphed into obsession. In the digital echo chamber, Elisa became both symbol and spectacle, another soul lost in the blur between fact and fiction. As public attention lingered, the Cecil Hotel sought transformation. By 2021, the infamous structure had been rebranded as Stay on Main, a hybrid of hotel and low-income housing, now under different management. New paint, new policies, and new signage tried to erase what once was. But buildings remember. And so do people. Tourists still photograph its facade. YouTubers chronicle their stay in hushed tones. Podcasts retell the story with dramatic music and whispered questions. The Cecil's past is now its brand, even as it attempts to flee it. And Elisa's case, her presence, her mystery, remains its spectral centerpiece. The final, enduring tragedy in a history already steeped in darkness. What really happened to Elisa Lam? Theories, stacked high and deep, still fail to bring clarity. The most grounded answer, the one offered by the coroner and supported by her medical history, is that she suffered a psychotic or manic episode. That her death, however improbable in mechanics, was a tragic accident. That explanation, while logical, leaves something unresolved in the collective mind. It doesn't soothe the ache of not knowing why, or how such a strange and improbable sequence of events could unfold without intervention, without warning, without witness. For some, that absence of certainty is unbearable. For others, it is the only fitting end to a story so layered in ambiguity. Perhaps there was no killer. No grand conspiracy. No hidden hand behind the door. Perhaps the horror lies not in what was done to Elisa, but in what she experienced alone. In the silence of a mind at war with itself, inside a building with a past full of ghosts. And so we return, again and again, to the image that launched it all. Elisa Lam, standing in an elevator. Pressing buttons. Looking out into a hallway that never reveals its secret. Hiding in the corner. Stepping out. Stepping back in. Waving her arms as though communicating with someone, or something, we cannot see. And then, she vanishes. The doors open. Close. Open again. As if the building itself can't decide whether to hold her or let her go. It is a moment suspended in time. No dialogue. No soundtrack. Just grainy footage and the flicker of something unfathomable beneath the surface. That elevator became a symbol. Of isolation. Of fear. Of mental illness. Of mystery. It is Elisa's last known appearance, and the world has watched it millions of times, searching for answers in her gestures, in her shadow, in the movement of the elevator itself. Elisa Lam is remembered not just for how she died, but for the questions she left behind. In an era where every moment is captured, filtered, uploaded, and dissected, her story exposed the limits of what we can truly know. It revealed how vulnerable truth is when passed through the prism of the internet. And how quickly the human heart can be buried beneath hashtags and headlines. She was more than a mystery. She was 21 years old. A reader. A writer. A dreamer. Someone who quoted Chuck Palahniuk and Virginia Woolf on her blog. Someone who struggled with her mind but refused to let that struggle define her. She wrote once, "You're always haunted by the idea you're wasting your life." And in the end, she became part of a narrative far larger than herself. There is no epilogue to Elisa Lam's story. No moment where it all makes sense. No final clue that ties every thread together. There is only what we know, and what we don't. She checked into a hotel with a long, dark history. She disappeared. She was found in a place she shouldn't have been. And in her absence, she became a mirror, for our fears, our questions, and the stories we tell to explain the inexplicable. Some say she died alone. But perhaps not. Perhaps, in the end, Elisa Lam became part of something larger, a shared moment in the collective consciousness. A symbol of how fragile life is, how fragile we are, and how deeply we crave understanding in a world that offers very little of it. The Cecil Hotel stands still. The elevator still opens and closes. And somewhere, in the minds of those who remember, Elisa remains. Not just as a question, but as a name. Westfield was supposed to be their new beginning. For Derek and Maria Broaddus, the town represented more than just a change of address, it was a symbolic turning point. A declaration. After years of late nights, penny pinching, and quiet sacrifices, they had finally made it. Not in the flashy, bragging sort of way, but in the subtle, solid, middle-class triumph that looked like a stately home on a tree-lined street, surrounded by good schools, peace, and promise. The couple had met in the city, Derek climbing the ranks in insurance, Maria working in design, and like many New Jersey natives with roots in suburbia, they'd always envisioned raising their family outside the hustle of Manhattan. Westfield, a commuter town with leafy sidewalks and colonial homes, seemed perfect. Clean, orderly, friendly, there was an unspoken pride here. The lawns were manicured, the SUVs were spotless, and the local paper read like a postcard: bake sales, school board meetings, church events. It felt like the kind of place where memories grew roots. 657 Boulevard was the crown jewel. A 6-bedroom Dutch colonial with deep brown shingles, white trim, and tall windows that caught the morning light just right. Built in 1905, the house had character, gables, dormers, and a wide front porch perfect for lemonade and lazy summer evenings. There were tall trees casting generous shadows across the yard, whispering in the breeze like old souls. It wasn't just a home, it was a statement. A reward for hard work. A place their children could grow into. The house had been on the market only a short time when Derek and Maria found it. From the first visit, Maria fell in love. The arched doorways, the built-in bookshelves, the creaky staircase that spoke of 100 years of family life. Derek was more cautious, naturally, but even he could see it, this was the one. At $1.3 million, it was a stretch, but they had savings, bonuses, and dreams. They closed in June 2014. They didn't move in right away. The house needed updates, nothing structural, but enough to warrant a few weeks of work. Derek oversaw the renovations. New quartz countertops in the kitchen. Fresh tile and fixtures in the bathrooms. New paint in the kids' rooms. They installed a security system, too, not because Westfield felt unsafe, but because Derek was practical. He liked knowing his family was protected. Cameras by the doors. Motion sensors by the windows. Just in case. Maria focused on the details, the right curtains, where to put the antique hutch her grandmother had given her, whether the reading nook should face the east garden or the backyard. The kids were excited too. At 6, 8, and 10, they saw the move as an adventure. They picked out rooms, drew crayon floor plans, ran barefoot across the empty hardwoods. For a few golden weeks, the Broaddus family stood on the threshold of a dream. Then the first letter arrived. It was a warm Monday evening. Derek had stopped by the house after work to check on the painting crew. He found the envelope in the mailbox, white, plain, no return address. The handwriting was old-fashioned, loopy, deliberate. It was addressed simply, the new owner. Curious, Derek tore it open on the porch, assuming it was a welcome note from a neighbor. It was not. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard. Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I see you have already begun renovations. The house is crying from all the noise and dust. You are changing it and it doesn't like it. Have you found what is in the walls yet? In time. I will help you find it. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. Welcome, again, to the neighborhood. Let the watching begin. The Watcher. Derek stood frozen on the porch. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn, but the words in his hands were what chilled him. At first, he laughed. Not out of amusement, but disbelief. It had to be a prank. Some weird, eccentric neighbor trying to scare the newcomers. He glanced around the quiet street, suddenly suspicious. A jogger passed by. A car pulled into a driveway down the block. Nothing seemed out of place, but everything suddenly felt wrong. He read the letter again. Then a third time. Back in the house, he snapped photos of it on his phone and sent them to Maria with the message, "We got a letter. Something's off. I'll explain when I'm home." Maria was alarmed but tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a joke. But as she read the letter in full at their old house later that night, her stomach turned. There was a darkness to it. An intelligence. It wasn't just creepy, it was personal. Someone had been watching them. Watching the renovations. Watching their children. She locked their front door. The next morning, they took the letter to the Westfield Police Department. The officer on duty read it with raised eyebrows. "Never seen anything quite like this," he admitted, making a copy for their file. "Probably just a crank. But we'll keep it on record. Keep your cameras on. If you see anything suspicious, call us." It was a weak reassurance. The Broadduses were left with the letter, and the knowledge that someone had been watching them, possibly from the moment they first stepped onto 657 Boulevard's porch. They began to notice things. A car slowing down just a little too long in front of the house. A man on the sidewalk pausing to tie his shoe, twice. Lights flickering at dusk. The sensation that even when the house was empty, it wasn't. Derek grew obsessive. He scoured the neighborhood, taking mental notes of every porch light, every security camera, every neighbor who looked just a bit too curious. He started arriving early to catch the mailman. He kept the lights on at night. He watched the footage from their cameras obsessively, looking for any clue. Maria, meanwhile, became more withdrawn. She didn't bring the kids by the house anymore. She stopped talking about paint colors. She stayed up late, checking the locks twice, then 3 times. She jumped at every unexpected noise. And then, 2 weeks later, a second letter came. To the Broaddus family. "I am pleased to know your names now. I've seen them on the workers' trucks. I've seen your children. You have lovely children. I've counted 3 so far. Was that the plan? 1 for each floor? Or were you just lucky? Once I know who's in each bedroom, I will know who is where. That will help me plan. Have you found what is in the walls yet? The house is eager to speak. But you must listen. Stop changing it. Stop hurting it. 657 Boulevard is mine. And now you are too. The Watcher." This time, Maria cried. There was no doubt now. This was not a harmless joke. Someone was tracking them, learning their routines, documenting their lives. They hadn't even moved in yet. For the first time, Derek wondered if they ever would. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Maria stopped by the new house. The late June air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and fading sunlight. She had come alone, just to check on the paint samples left in the upstairs bedrooms. The kids were with Derek, and for the first time in weeks, she had a moment to herself. The house was still, empty of furniture, voices, and life, but it buzzed with the electricity of becoming. She stepped up onto the porch, still getting used to its creak under her weight, and glanced at the mailbox out of habit. There, nestled among a few flyers and a catalog, was a single white envelope. No return address. No stamp. Just 5 words written in shaky, blocky handwriting. 657 Boulevard. She paused. Something about the letters made her stomach flutter. They were deliberate, oddly spaced, as if each had been traced over. Still, she assumed it was from a neighbor, maybe someone welcoming them to the community. That's what people did in places like Westfield, right? She opened it casually. The greeting was formal, oddly warm. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard. Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. She smiled, reflexively. Then read on. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. Maria's eyes paused at that line. She read it again. What? She kept going, each sentence unraveling whatever comfort the previous one offered. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched it in the 1960s. Now it is my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. The words clawed at her. She looked up from the letter and glanced down the street. It was empty, quiet. The kind of calm that felt curated, like a film set. A breeze passed through the trees, rustling leaves that sounded suddenly sinister. She returned to the letter, now reading with dread. I see you have already begun renovations. After all, you bought 657 Boulevard to tear it down as so many before you have done. The house is crying from all the noise and dust. You are changing it and it doesn't like it. Her breath caught. Have you found what is in the walls yet? In time, they will. They? The letter felt less like a message and more like a curse, cryptic, obsessive, and deeply personal. Then came the part that made her blood run cold. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. Plan what? Maria blinked, heart pounding in her ears. The letter ended without a signature. Just 2 words, written in a jagged scrawl that felt colder than the rest. The Watcher. She drove home in silence. When Derek saw her walk in, pale and quiet, he knew something was wrong. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it in one sitting, his jaw tightening with each line. There was a long pause when he finished. Neither spoke. Then Derek said, "I'm calling the police." The officer who arrived looked barely 30. His uniform was crisp, his notepad half full when he sat down at their kitchen table and read the letter twice, eyebrows furrowed. When he finished, he looked up at Derek and Maria with a heavy sigh. "You're not going to like hearing this," he said carefully. "But there's not much we can do." "Not yet." "What do you mean?" Maria asked, her voice rising. "Someone's watching our house. Watching our kids. There's no threat here. No crime," the officer said. "It's weird, yeah. Creepy. But unless they do something, or unless we can prove who it is, there's not much legal ground." Derek leaned forward. "What if they're already watching? What if this is just the beginning?" The officer didn't respond right away. Then he said something even more unsettling. "We've seen stuff like this before. Usually, it fizzles out. But if anything escalates, call us right away." Then he stood up, nodded, and left. They were alone again. Alone with the letter. That night, Derek couldn't sleep. Neither could Maria. She lay awake in the dark beside him, eyes fixed on the ceiling, thoughts racing. What did the watcher mean by second coming? What was in the walls? Why were they being targeted? Across the hall, their children slept, blissfully unaware. But Maria couldn't help thinking, someone already knows which bedrooms they're in. 2 weeks passed. Then came another letter. It arrived just like the first, hand-delivered, without a stamp, tucked inside the mailbox like a secret. Same thick white envelope. Same odd, blocky handwriting. Derek found it this time. He opened it in the front hallway of the old house they were still living in, standing beside a pile of unopened boxes they'd hoped would already be in their new home by now. This one was worse. It wasn't vague anymore. It was intimate. The watcher mentioned the children, by name. Not their full names, but their nicknames, the kind only family used. Nicknames that had never appeared online, on paperwork, or in public. I see that young blood is once again at 657 Boulevard. That was the line that made Maria drop the glass she was holding. It shattered on the floor, unnoticed. The watcher spoke about the children like they were property. Like he was entitled to them. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. You have filled it with their laughter and voices. But have you yet decided which of the children will have the bedrooms facing the street? It will help me know where to place myself. There was a sickness in the phrasing, too calm, too calculated. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about control. Then came the third letter. This one was longer. It referenced details so specific it made Maria feel ill. The color of the contractor's van, the exact location where the painters had stored their ladders, the makeshift breakfast nook Maria had set up while she and the kids toured the house one last time. He mentioned overhearing their conversations. I pass by often. I see you. I hear you. I learn you. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't someone just trying to scare them. It was a threat. That night, Derek took down the kids' photos from the refrigerator. They stopped bringing the children to 657 Boulevard. The once thrilling excitement of showing them their new rooms, planning where to hang artwork, dreaming of Christmas mornings and birthdays, it all disappeared overnight. Instead, the house stood empty, as if holding its breath. Derek had security cameras installed the next morning. Every angle was covered: porch, driveway, backyard, side gates. He added motion detectors, night vision, live alerts. He spent hours scanning footage, frame by frame, looking for anything: a car that lingered too long, a shadow that shouldn't be there, a face in the window. They hired a private investigator. Former NYPD. He ran checks on contractors, canvassed the neighborhood, even staked out the house for a few nights from a car down the street. Nothing. No letters caught in the act. No sign of someone approaching the mailbox. The watcher moved like a ghost. They brought in a former FBI profiler. He reviewed the letters, made notes in tight scribbles along the margins, read them aloud in a flat, clinical voice. His conclusion was chilling. The writer is obsessed. Deeply. Possibly mentally ill. Most likely male. Likely older. Most likely nearby. He suggested the watcher might live on the street, perhaps even directly across from the house. Someone with time. Patience. Intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's routines. It's not random, he told them. It's personal. They went to the police again. This time, the department assigned a detective full-time to the case. He agreed, something wasn't right. But there were still no fingerprints, no cameras that caught a suspect, no legal grounds for action. The letters themselves weren't enough. There had been no trespassing, no violence, no break-ins. Nothing actionable. The detective advised them to stay quiet. Don't talk to the neighbors. Don't tell the media. Why? Because if it's someone nearby, he said, you don't want them to know you're onto them. So they stayed quiet. But suspicion seeped in anyway. Maria stopped waving at the woman across the street who used to water her garden every morning. Derek eyed the elderly couple next door as they brought in their recycling bins. The mailman. The teenager with headphones. The man with the dog who always walked by at dusk. Everyone was a suspect. They still hadn't moved in. The house stood beautiful and hollow, wrapped in silence and security lights. Friends asked when they were settling in. Co-workers offered congratulations on the new home. They lied. Said there were delays with the contractors, issues with permits. But the truth was far stranger, and far darker. And 657 Boulevard was beginning to feel less like a dream and more like a trap. There were strange figures all over the block. It wasn't something Derek and Maria noticed at first. When you're house hunting, you don't look too closely at the people mowing their lawns or carrying groceries from their cars. You notice the curb appeal, the school ratings, the walkability. But once the letters started coming, once it was clear someone was watching, they began seeing the neighborhood differently. Everything changed. The friendly smiles now looked rehearsed. The idle waves from porches suddenly seemed too well-timed. Conversations with neighbors felt like interviews wrapped in small talk. And at the center of their suspicions was a man named Michael Langford. The Langfords lived next door in a fading two-story home with chipping paint and tangled hedges. Michael, now in his early 60s, lived there with his elderly mother, Peggy, and a few adult siblings who came and went at odd hours. Their house had a direct line of sight to the Broaddus's new property, and to the bedrooms facing the street. Michael was eccentric. That was the word people used. Polite, but off. He had a slow, shuffling gait, and he often wandered the block aimlessly. He didn't drive. He'd show up at block parties uninvited, talk to himself at grocery stores, and sometimes stand too long outside someone's gate, staring without blinking. He'd lived in that house since the 1960s. Just as the watcher claimed. The police questioned him shortly after the second letter arrived. A detective sat with him in the Langford living room, asked about the letters, asked about 657 Boulevard, asked if he had anything to do with it. Michael denied everything. Softly. Calmly. Almost too calmly. He said he had no idea what the letters were about. He claimed not to care who lived next door. And then, according to the report, he stared at the detective for a long time and said nothing at all. The police couldn't make an arrest. They had no handwriting match, no forensic evidence, no witness testimony. Just suspicion. But it was enough to keep Derek awake at night. He began his own investigation. Every morning, after checking the security footage, Derek would take notes on the Langfords. Who came in? Who left? What cars were parked out front? What windows were open? When lights turned on? He tracked trash days. Gardeners. Visitors. Delivery trucks. It became an obsession. At one point, Derek learned that Michael's father, now deceased, had once told neighbors he watched everything that happened on the block. It was almost too on the nose. But it wasn't enough. The police couldn't get a search warrant without proof. The prosecutor's office wouldn't bring charges. And soon, even law enforcement began pulling back. I know how this looks, the detective admitted. But legally, we've got nothing. There were other suspects, too. One was a man who had made an offer on the house before the Broadduses but had lost out in a bidding war. He lived a few towns over and had seemed overly upset when his bid was rejected. Derek wondered if resentment could have turned into something darker. But a background check revealed nothing. He had no history of violence or harassment. He'd never been to Westfield since the bid. No connections. No motive, at least not one anyone could prove. Still, the theory lingered. What if the watcher was someone who believed the house should have been theirs? Then came a detail that changed everything. The Woods family, the previous owners of 657 Boulevard, reached out after learning what was happening. They had been kind and helpful when selling the home, empty nesters eager to downsize, eager to pass the house on to another growing family. Over the phone, Andrea Woods hesitated, then admitted something. They had received a letter, too. Just one. It arrived a few days before they moved out. It mentioned the house, referred to it as watched, but wasn't nearly as detailed or disturbing as the one sent to the Broadduses. They assumed it was a prank. A joke. Some local weirdo with too much time. They threw it away. And they never told the Broadduses. Derek nearly dropped the phone. "What did it say?" he asked. "I don't remember," Andrea replied. "Honestly, it just seemed like nonsense. We didn't think it was serious. But it was. That one letter proved something terrible. The watcher didn't start with them. It was bigger than one buyer. Bigger than one family. Someone had been watching 657 Boulevard for years. And now, the house was watching them back." Derek was unraveling. Not all at once, but slowly, steadily, like threads pulled loose from a suit once perfectly tailored for a life he no longer recognized. By day, he went to work in the city, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But by night, he transformed into something else. A man obsessed. A man haunted. He stayed up until the early hours of the morning, hunched over the dining table in their temporary rental, surrounded by stacks of paper, open maps, scribbled notes. He pored over Google Earth images of the neighborhood. He printed satellite views and drew angles from every house that had a line of sight into 657 Boulevard. He made suspect lists, color-coded by likelihood. Cross-referenced renovations with sightings, utility calls, license plates. He reviewed motion camera footage frame by frame, looking not just for people, but patterns. The way the wind moved certain trees. The time garbage trucks passed. The shadows that stretched across the lawn. He built flowcharts. He made timelines. He talked less and muttered more. The way he saw it, every second the house sat empty, the watcher was winning. Maria, meanwhile, was breaking differently. She cried often and without warning. In the car. In the shower. In the supermarket. She started jumping at noises. Ignoring texts. Checking the locks, then rechecking. She no longer parked close to the house or even wanted to drive past it. Her hands trembled when she walked past mailboxes, any mailbox, and she avoided saying the words, "the house," around the children. She was grieving. Not for someone who had died, but for something that had never truly lived, the life they were supposed to build at 657 Boulevard. The lazy Saturdays. The family birthdays. The laughter echoing through its vast, sunlit rooms. Their dream home sat empty. And still, it devoured them. They were paying a mortgage and property taxes on a house they couldn't live in, while also covering rent on the small place they were now crammed into. Their savings were bleeding out. Every month that passed, they slid deeper into financial stress. So they made a decision: they would sell. But by then, the house had a reputation. Word had gotten out, just whispers at first, but enough to spook potential buyers. A few showed interest. One couple even made it to the inspection stage. But the moment someone mentioned the phrase, the letters, interest vanished. Nobody wanted to live under a microscope. Nobody wanted to tuck their children into a house that whispered through envelopes. The Broadduses lowered the asking price. Then again. And again. Still no offers. So they tried something desperate. They filed a lawsuit against the Woods family. The lawsuit claimed non-disclosure. That one final letter the Woodses had received, the one they tossed out like junk mail, should have been disclosed before the sale. In court filings, the Broadduses alleged that the omission was intentional. They argued that they would never have bought the house had they known someone had been watching it even before them. But the judge disagreed. The case was dismissed. No damages. No recourse. The media caught wind of it then. Local news. Then regional. Then national. Headlines swirled with phrases like, "Cursed House," "Stalked by the Watcher," and "Westfield's Dark Secret." And with that attention came the most painful insult of all. Accusation. People began to speculate. The internet filled in the blanks with its usual cynicism. What if the Broadduses had sent the letters themselves? What if they had buyer's remorse? Or had realized they couldn't afford the house and were trying to get out from under the mortgage? Strangers online suggested it was a hoax. A scheme. A cry for attention. Maybe a weird marketing stunt for a book deal. Neighbors whispered. Co-workers asked strange questions. Parents at the kids' school kept their distance. Derek and Maria were devastated. But they agreed to take lie detector tests, both passed. The private investigators found no evidence of deception. The FBI profiler insisted the tone and vocabulary of the letters didn't match Derek's or Maria's writing patterns. The letters were too fluid, too strange. There were old-fashioned phrases, archaic references. One letter mentioned watching the house's second coming, something no modern voice would say naturally. But rumors don't need evidence to spread. They just need a mystery. And now, the Broadduses weren't just victims. They were suspects, in the eyes of the town, and in the court of public opinion. 657 Boulevard stood waiting, untouched, its windows like blank eyes staring out onto a quiet street full of people who might be smiling, or spying. And the watcher? He never wrote again. Not right away. But the silence was almost worse. Because now Derek and Maria knew. Someone out there was still watching. In the end, they let go. After 5 years of fear, of lawyers and investigators, of empty rooms echoing with a life that never happened, the Broadduses made the only decision left to them. They sold the house. It was 2019 when the papers were finally signed, quietly, without fanfare or press. The sale went through at a steep loss, hundreds of thousands below what they'd paid. The market had rebounded since 2014, but 657 Boulevard was different. Its name had become a warning, a ghost story, a dare. It didn't just carry bad vibes, it carried a reputation. They had once called it their dream home. Now it was something to survive. A few weeks after the closing, just when they thought they might finally breathe again, the final letter arrived. No stamp. No return address. Just like the others, handwritten, blocky, and cruel. The envelope was addressed not to Derek or Maria, but simply to you. Inside, one short page. One last message. You are despised by the house. And the watcher has won. There was no ambiguity in the words this time. No poetic distance. It was a pronouncement, cold, personal, triumphant. It was over. But the house had chosen sides. No one was ever arrested. No charges were filed. The case went cold, then quietly closed. The investigators had DNA from one of the envelopes, female, but it matched no one in the national database. The fingerprint analysis was inconclusive. No suspects were ever named publicly. The Langfords were never charged. The man who lost the bid was cleared. Derek and Maria, tested, interviewed, scrutinized, were left with nothing but trauma. The watcher remained a shadow. A signature. A myth. A mystery that had outlived its victims. 657 Boulevard still stands. The shutters are still painted green. The porch still wraps around the front like open arms. Children still ride bikes down the block, and sprinklers still tick through the lawns on summer afternoons. From the outside, it is perfect, classic, elegant, untouched. But for those who know the story, it will never be just a house again. It is a question with no answer. A lock with no key. A home that watches back. And sometimes, when the mailbox clangs shut, and the wind moves just right through the hedges, people still wonder. Who was the watcher? And worse, are they still watching? The story of the watcher spread like wildfire. First it was whispers in Westfield. Then it hit the local papers. Then regional news. And soon, it had crossed state lines, picked up by national outlets, dissected on talk shows, tweeted and retweeted into viral infamy. People couldn't look away. The idea was too terrifying, too primal, that a stranger could claim ownership over your life, your walls, your future, with only a pen and a mailbox. It became the subject of true crime podcasts, long-form articles, conspiracy threads, Reddit theories. A best-selling book followed. Then a high-budget Netflix adaptation. Screenwriters twisted the facts into fiction, added drama, subplots, horror. But for those who lived it, Derek, Maria, and their children, no script could match the raw, helpless terror of feeling hunted in your own sanctuary. Theirs was not a haunted house. It was a violated one. And the haunting wasn't supernatural. It was human. For the Broadduses, the house that was supposed to be their forever home, where their children would grow up, where Christmas mornings would be shared and family photos hung on the walls, became a prison. Not one made of brick or barred windows, but of paranoia. Of letters in the dark. Of questions without answers. Every neighbor became a suspect. Every window, a threat. Every creak in the night, a warning. They moved out, but the fear followed. The shame. The stigma. The sense that someone still knew exactly where they were, and exactly what they feared most. And 657 Boulevard? It still stands. The hedges are trimmed now. The roof has been patched. A family lives there again, one that says they've never received a letter. Maybe the watcher grew bored. Maybe they stopped. Maybe they're gone. Or maybe they're just waiting. Waiting for new blood. Waiting for someone to forget what happened. Waiting for the story to fade, so they can return to the only house they ever truly loved. Because the watcher never claimed to hate the house. They claimed to belong to it. And somewhere, maybe not far, maybe just across the street, they may still be watching. Waiting. And smiling. The Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center in western Massachusetts sat quietly among the rolling hills of the Pioneer Valley. Flanked by groves of birch and maple trees, the campus resembled more a sleepy college than a federal hospital. The red brick buildings, some dating back to the early 20th century, bore the weathered marks of time, peeling paint, rusted gutters, ivy climbing the outer walls as if nature sought to reclaim them. On foggy mornings, when mist clung to the treetops and the dew made the grass shimmer like glass, the facility took on an almost eerie stillness, as though it had long been waiting for something to happen. In the early 1990s, life at the Northampton VA moved at a languid, predictable pace. Most of the patients were elderly men, veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, whose bodies were worn down by time, disease, and the quiet devastation of memory. The sounds of the hospital were subtle and repetitive, the shuffle of slippers against linoleum, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional crackle from a nurse's radio. It was not a place where excitement lived, nor where it was wanted. Tranquility was the rule, and any deviation from it was treated as a threat to the system. The staff were used to this rhythm. They were mostly locals, nurses, orderlies, and administrative workers who had either grown up nearby or had settled in the area to escape the noise of more urban settings. The turnover rate was low. People didn't leave unless they retired. The nurses, in particular, were known for their compassion and commitment, many of them serving in the same wards for years. They knew their patients by name, knew their habits, knew their war stories, even the ones the veterans told only when the lights were low and sleep wouldn't come. And among them all, one nurse stood out. Kristen Gilbert joined the staff in 1989, young and striking in both appearance and demeanor. She was tall, with dark, expressive eyes and a presence that seemed to command attention without demanding it. Her posture was perfect, her steps purposeful. Everything about her suggested confidence, poise, and capability. Patients responded to her immediately, some flirted with her, others simply found comfort in her presence. Veterans who had once been combative or withdrawn became oddly compliant in her care. She spoke softly, rarely raised her voice, and always appeared in control. Her colleagues admired her. Doctors praised her clinical acumen, her swift decisions during emergencies, and her seemingly innate ability to remain calm under pressure. She had an intuition about patients that bordered on the uncanny. Supervisors took note of her, too. Kristen was the type of nurse that made a unit run smoothly. If she was scheduled for a shift, the evening would go better. Fewer complaints. Fewer errors. Her personnel file described her as diligent, dependable, a model employee. But perfection has a way of inviting scrutiny. And sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest things. At first, it was nothing more than a strange coincidence. A patient who had been stable for days would suddenly take a turn for the worse. A code blue would be called late at night, often during the same shifts. The patients who died were usually older, often with complicated medical histories. Nothing unusual, on paper. After all, this was a hospital for aging war veterans, many of whom were terminal or struggling with chronic illness. But the numbers began to shift. Where once the facility might lose 1 or 2 patients in a month, the deaths began to occur weekly. Then more frequently. And they seemed to cluster around certain times. Certain shifts. Certain names on the duty roster. Nurses whispered about it during smoke breaks behind the loading dock, their words hushed, as though saying them too loudly might make them real. Still, no one wanted to believe something was wrong. Not really. Not with Kristen. She was always there when something happened, running into the room, calling for help, administering CPR, checking vitals. She reacted faster than anyone else. She was the one calling codes, the one who first noticed irregularities on monitors, the one who tried to resuscitate the unresponsive. No one could accuse her of negligence. If anything, she seemed almost too vigilant. Yet questions lingered. One nurse, Janice Miller, had worked at the VA for nearly a decade. She prided herself on knowing her patients well and had a sharp memory for detail. One morning, after yet another unexpected death on Ward C, she sat alone in the break room, stirring her coffee and staring out the window at the leafless trees beyond. "That's the third one this week," she muttered aloud, not to anyone in particular. "Fourth," said a voice behind her. Janice turned to see Paul Green, a respiratory therapist, leaning against the doorway. He looked tired, the bags under his eyes darker than usual. "Who was the fourth?" she asked. "Mr. Donnelly, last night. Code blue at 3:10 a.m. They tried everything. Didn't make it." "Jesus," Janice said. "He was doing okay yesterday. Stable vitals. Talking, even." Paul nodded. "I know. I saw him during rounds." "Who was on?" Paul hesitated, then said, "Kristen." Janice didn't respond immediately. She just stared back out the window, the gears in her head slowly turning. No one wanted to say it. Not yet. At staff meetings, supervisors offered platitudes about how patient decline is sometimes unpredictable, especially in a long-term care facility. When questioned about the spike in mortality, administrators reminded staff of the patient's ages and complex medical conditions. "We deal with fragile populations," they said. "These things happen." And maybe they were right. Maybe. But the veterans themselves seemed to sense something, too. Some of the more lucid patients started requesting transfers to different wards. One man refused to let Kristen check his four, snapping at her with unusual aggression. Another insisted on being discharged early, despite being warned it could be dangerous to leave. "I'm not staying here another night," he told his son. "Not while she's on." The son didn't understand. No one did. But the old man was insistent. What no one outside the facility knew, what few even inside it truly grasped, was that the pattern had begun. A pattern that would soon stretch across months, claiming lives without explanation, wrapped in the sterile language of medical uncertainty. For now, the deaths were just whispers. Small tragedies explained away by age and illness. But death has a rhythm, and this one was out of tune. Kristen Gilbert continued to work her shifts with grace and efficiency. She continued to win praise, to earn the trust of those around her. And as the fog rolled over the hills each morning, curling through the bare trees and pressing against the windows, the hospital held its breath. Because something had changed. And it had started with the dead. By 1995, the tranquility that once defined the Northampton VA had begun to fracture. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, an odd call here, a sudden code blue there. At first, no one wanted to see the pattern. But the numbers told their own story. Between late 1995 and into the following year, a wave of emergencies swept through the medical center. The calls for resuscitation, code blues, became unnervingly frequent. What had once been a rare event, met with urgency and coordinated chaos, was now common enough to feel routine. Nurses stopped asking if a code would happen on a given night. They began asking when. The shift that drew the most attention was the 3 to 11 p.m. swing, quiet hours when daylight faded and the hospital slipped into a more vulnerable state. Less staff, fewer administrators. A skeleton crew watching over fragile lives. And yet, it was during these hours that tragedy struck the most. Night after night, alarms would blare down the halls, flatlines, erratic heartbeats, gasps from patients who had been laughing or resting peacefully moments before. Doctors were paged. Crash carts were wheeled in. Chest compressions began, IVs were flushed, medications were pushed. Sometimes the patients came back. Often, they didn't. But what unsettled the staff the most wasn't the frequency. It was the faces. These weren't the typical deaths expected in a long-term care facility. These weren't the men already slipping away, whose names were already penciled into hospice charts or discussed gently with family members. No, these were patients who had been stable. Recovering. Laughing with aides just hours earlier. Men who were eating dinner, playing cards in the rec room, asking when their grandchildren would visit. Some were even preparing for discharge. Then, without warning, they were gone. Veterans who had survived war, injury, and years of chronic illness were suddenly collapsing in their beds, gasping for breath, their hearts stopping with no warning. And over time, as the ward walls echoed with the steady rise of code blues, the same name kept surfacing. Not in official reports, not on the overhead speakers, but in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Kristen. It seemed that every shift she worked ended in tragedy. The first to truly notice were the other nurses. They were too experienced not to catch the signs. Linda French, a senior nurse with 30 years of experience, began quietly logging deaths in her day planner. She didn't write anything more than a name and a time, just enough to track the pattern. It was subtle at first, spread out over weeks. But as winter deepened and 1996 rolled in, the pages filled faster. Linda's pen moved with growing unease. The security staff noticed too. The orderlies. Even the janitorial crew, who came in at the end of the shift to mop the rooms, began to joke, nervously, that death seemed to follow Kristen around. It was hard to reconcile the Kristen they knew with the implications of what they were feeling. After all, Kristen Gilbert was still the golden nurse. She remained calm during emergencies. She was the one who usually found the patients first, who called for help while others scrambled. She performed CPR with fierce determination, her voice steady even as chaos unfolded around her. She stayed late, covered extra shifts. No one wanted to question her dedication. And yet, there was something unnatural about her presence during those moments. Something eerie. She was always nearby, as though anticipating the exact moment a patient would flatline. She'd show up outside the room seconds before the alarm sounded, sometimes already holding gloves or preparing a syringe. And while others around her seemed shaken by the mounting toll, Kristen remained composed, cool, almost clinical. Never surprised. Not even once. Rumors began to bloom in the quiet places, the break room, the stairwells, whispered across the nurse's station like guilty secrets. Some said she craved attention. That the adrenaline of emergency gave her a kind of high. Others suggested darker motives. One night, an orderly named Mike, who had always kept to himself, muttered something beneath his breath as another patient died on Kristen's shift. "Angel of Death," he said, not looking up. The name caught on. It was never said around Kristen. Never to her face. But it traveled. Like a rumor, or a warning. Still, no one went to the administrators. Not at first. There were no accusations, only suspicions. No evidence, only statistics. And Kristen had built her reputation carefully. To challenge her without proof would be career suicide. Besides, she was still Kristen. Charming. Professional. She brought homemade cookies to the nurses' lounge. She stayed late to help with charting. She remembered birthdays. Even when people began to suspect, they found themselves questioning their own doubts. Was it paranoia? Coincidence? The randomness of aging bodies finally giving up? Or was it something else? Some staff tried to forget what they were feeling, to push it down and focus on their work. But others began to watch more closely. They began to document, record, ask subtle questions. And though no one dared say it aloud, one truth grew harder and harder to ignore. Where Kristen Gilbert walked, death was never far behind. It was Deborah Hedges who finally broke the silence. For months, she'd watched the hospital teeter on the edge of something unspoken. She was the chief pharmacist at Northampton VA, a quiet but meticulous woman with a mind for details and a low tolerance for chaos. She believed in systems, orders, ledgers, logs. She trusted math. Math didn't lie. And lately, the math wasn't adding up. She first noticed it during a routine audit in early 1996. A discrepancy. Small, but strange, a missing vial of epinephrine. Then another. And another. Always unrecorded, always unexplained. The logs had no documentation of them being dispensed. The paper trail simply stopped. But Deborah knew her inventory, and she knew when something was off. Epinephrine was not a casual medication. It was powerful, used only in emergencies, to jumpstart a failing heart. Normally, it was tightly monitored, double-checked, and logged precisely. Nurses didn't just take it. And it certainly didn't just vanish. She began looking back through the usage logs, pulling patient charts, piecing together a puzzle that no one else seemed willing to examine. The pattern that emerged chilled her. The missing epinephrine always corresponded to code blues. And the code blues always happened on the same shift. Kristen's shift. At first, Deborah said nothing. She couldn't accuse a nurse, especially not that nurse, on a hunch. Kristen was still a star in the eyes of many, competent, reliable, admired. But the numbers grew. And the deaths kept coming. By late spring, the whispers that had long echoed through the hospital corridors turned into something sharper, something urgent. Nurses who had once joked nervously now spoke with dry voices, their eyes scanning shift rosters with dread. Some began requesting transfers, off the 3 to 11 shift, off Ward C entirely. "I can't do this anymore," one nurse confided to Deborah in the supply room, her voice low, trembling. "It's like, we're waiting for someone to drop. Every night. And it's always when she's here." Another nurse left an anonymous note in a supervisor's inbox. It was only one line. "When she's on, patients die." It was short, but it said everything. The hospital administrators, who had spent months brushing aside concerns with bureaucratic platitudes and statistical rationalizations, could no longer ignore the smoke. There was too much of it. Death was one thing in a veterans' hospital. An internal investigation was opened quietly, without press or panic. Staff were interviewed. Logs were reviewed. Pharmacy audits were pulled in full. Kristen's patient records were examined under a new lens. And that summer, in July 1996, the hospital made a call. The FBI was brought in. It wasn't a public affair, not yet. But agents arrived in plain clothes and sat in unmarked vehicles outside the facility. They interviewed nurses discreetly, combed through medication inventories, tracked batch numbers, and compared them to the growing list of the dead. They mapped the incidents, times, dates, victims, symptoms. The overlaps were undeniable. Kristen Gilbert's name surfaced again and again. She had been present at nearly every suspicious death. She had access to the medications. She was calm, almost disturbingly so, in the face of every emergency. And, as the FBI would later discover, she had something else too, a trail of inconsistencies in her notes, timing gaps in her whereabouts, and increasingly erratic behavior behind closed doors. The investigation was still quiet, but the walls were closing in. Kristen didn't know it yet, but her shift was nearly over. As investigators quietly peeled back the layers of Kristen Gilbert's professional life, they uncovered something unexpected. Something not in medical records or medication logs. A love story. If you could call it that. In the early months of the investigation, as agents sifted through schedules, pharmacy inventory sheets, and personnel files, a new name kept appearing beside Kristen's: James Perot. A tall, quiet hospital security guard who had worked the same shifts on more nights than could be chalked up to chance. At first, it was just another overlap. A coincidence. But soon, something stranger took shape. Co-workers remembered the shift in Kristen when James was around. It was subtle at first, a laugh that lasted too long, an extra visit to the front desk. But over time, their flirtation became difficult to ignore. The way she lit up when he entered the room. The glances exchanged in passing. The long conversations in empty hallways. She would find reasons to walk through the corridors where he patrolled, excuses to be near him. Kristen, the married mother of two, had fallen hard, and openly, for the quiet security guard. And then, the truly disturbing part. As agents laid code blue calls over shift schedules, another pattern emerged. The frequency of deaths increased when James Perot was working, too. Not just Kristen. Kristen and James. Together. It was an eerie symmetry. On nights when both were on shift, the hospital felt like it held its breath. Emergencies happened more often. Patients flatlined more suddenly. Chaos bloomed out of nowhere, then Kristen would appear, calm, commanding, saving lives or trying to. And James would be there too, often arriving just moments later to secure the area, to assist, to witness. The theory that emerged from hushed meetings between hospital officials and federal agents was both chilling and absurd. Was Kristen Gilbert manufacturing medical crises to gain the attention and admiration of her lover? Was she deliberately pushing patients into cardiac arrest just so she could play the hero? Was it a deadly form of performance, an elaborate, deranged mating call? It seemed too bizarre to be real. And yet, the evidence kept circling back. One nurse later told investigators that Kristen was different around James. Not just happier, excited, almost manic. She thrived in emergencies when he was there. She took charge. She was loud, bold. She wanted to be seen. Some suspected she wanted to be admired. By him. She was a star when the chaos hit, the nurse said. And he always seemed to be right behind her. Kristen's personal life, too, was beginning to unravel. Her marriage was strained to the breaking point. She had grown distant at home. Her husband, Glenn Gilbert, sensed something was wrong, though he had no idea just how wrong. Kristen began spending more time at work, taking extra shifts, staying late even when she wasn't needed. There were unexplained absences, evasive answers. And at the hospital, people had started to notice. She wasn't subtle, one orderly remembered. It was like, she wanted us to know. The connection between the Code Blues and Kristen's relationship with James gave investigators a new, darker theory. What if the deaths weren't just about attention, or a desire to feel needed? What if they were a gift? What if the ultimate thrill wasn't just in saving lives, but in orchestrating death, controlling it, bending it to her will, all with her lover watching? It was a terrifying possibility. Because if true, it meant the killings weren't random. They weren't accidents. They were staged performances. And the patients, veterans who had survived wars, outlived friends and families, were nothing more than a theater of one woman's obsession. The investigation, once rooted in missing drugs and medical logs, now had a second pulse, the psychology of Kristen Gilbert. Her motives. Her cravings. Her darkness. She was no longer just a nurse. She was becoming something else entirely. By the fall of 1996, Kristen Gilbert was no longer the glowing presence at the heart of the hospital. The eyes that once watched her with admiration now followed her with suspicion. The halls of Northampton VA, once her stage, had turned cold. Tight conversations stopped when she entered a room. Co-workers no longer smiled back. Records were being pulled. Security footage reviewed. Inventory double-checked. Kristen could feel it, like pressure on her skin. The air had changed. And then, abruptly, she was gone. In November, without warning or ceremony, Kristen Gilbert resigned from her position. Officially, she cited personal reasons. Unofficially, she knew the walls were closing in. She may have hoped that stepping away would quiet the storm. That distance would grant her invisibility. But the storm was already out of her hands. What Kristen didn't know was that the FBI had escalated their inquiry. What began as a quiet investigation had become a full-scale federal probe. The Bureau was no longer just interviewing staff or cross-checking pharmacy logs. They were digging, literally. Over the next year, several former patients were exhumed from their graves. These were men who had died quietly under Kristen's care, whose passing had been explained away as the unfortunate but unremarkable decline of aging veterans. But now their deaths were being revisited with a colder, more forensic lens. Pathologists reopened the cases. Toxicology tests were run on preserved tissue. The results were conclusive. In multiple cases, epinephrine was present in concentrations far beyond therapeutic use, levels that could only have been injected deliberately, and in doses designed not to heal but to kill. The implications were staggering. Epinephrine, when used correctly, could shock a heart back to life. But too much, especially administered to vulnerable patients, did the opposite. It flooded the heart, triggering fatal arrhythmias, chaos in the bloodstream, sudden collapse. And it left behind no obvious trace, unless you knew to look. Now, they were looking. What emerged from months of interviews, lab results, and schedule reconstructions was a near-clinical portrait of precision. Kristen's presence correlated with the missing drugs. With the flatlines. With the bodies. Every shift she worked was mapped against fatal cardiac arrests. And time after time, the same pattern repeated itself, a patient stable 1 hour, dead the next. A nurse unaccounted for in the critical minutes before. A drug vial missing. A story that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was connective. The pieces snapped together. Kristen Gilbert, the nurse once praised for her poise and competence, now stood at the center of one of the most chilling criminal investigations in the history of American healthcare. In 1998, a grand jury indicted her on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The victims were all military veterans, men who had placed their trust, and their final moments, in the hands of a nurse who was supposed to care for them. The media descended quickly, hungry for headlines. In press conferences and nightly news segments, reporters branded her with a grim moniker, the Angel of Death. It stuck. It haunted. Prosecutors were more precise. They described Kristen Gilbert as a manipulative sociopath, someone who manufactured crises to gain admiration. She injected her patients with fatal doses of epinephrine, then took command of the emergency. Her CPR was flawless. Her voice steady. To the untrained eye, she looked like a savior. But the prosecution argued she was the architect of the very disasters she worked to fix. They accused her of playing a game of life and death, not out of rage or revenge, but to be admired. To be seen. To feel something. But as the trial preparations began and psychiatric experts weighed in, a darker profile began to emerge. It wasn't just admiration she craved. It was control. She had built a world where she alone determined who lived and who died. Where chaos bent to her will, and death became a tool to wield. Her patients were not people to her, they were currency. Triggers. Applause. Kristen didn't just want attention. She wanted dominion. She wasn't playing hero. She was playing God. By early 2000, the nation was watching. What began as a whisper among nurses in a quiet Massachusetts hospital had grown into a full-blown national obsession. Kristen Gilbert, the attractive, composed, seemingly devoted VA nurse, was now the accused serial killer dubbed by the press as the Angel of. Her trial began in March of that year, held in U.S. District Court in Springfield, Massachusetts, under tight security and endless media scrutiny. For weeks, headlines blared across the country. TV trucks parked outside the courthouse. Sketch artists captured her every expression. True crime pundits dissected her case with forensic zeal. It wasn't just the horror of her crimes that fascinated people, it was the motive. How could a nurse, a mother, someone trained to save lives, commit such acts? For 7 weeks, jurors sat in silence as the prosecution built their chilling case. They called dozens of witnesses, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and hospital administrators. One by one, they took the stand and described the pattern that had haunted the Northampton VA between 1995 and 1996, how stable patients collapsed without warning, how code blues spiked during the 3 to 11 p.m. shift, and how Kristen was always there. One nurse, voice shaking, described watching Kristen rush toward a patient moments before the code was called. Another remembered her expression, calm, almost amused, as staff frantically performed CPR. It was like, she wasn't worried, they said. She looked thrilled. Testimony after testimony painted the same unsettling portrait. Kristen wasn't just calm during emergencies, she seemed energized by them. She was always first to arrive, always eager to take charge, always composed in the chaos she may have created. Epinephrine, the prosecution explained, was her weapon of choice. A small, colorless injection. Impossible to detect without autopsy. Lethal in excess. And in case after case, toxicology confirmed her signature. The defense fought back with a different story. They claimed Kristen was a scapegoat, a convenient villain for a hospital riddled with systemic problems. Their experts argued that the deaths could have been caused by underlying conditions, by miscommunication, by chaotic and overstressed hospital routines. They suggested that errors were common, that medication sometimes disappeared due to sloppy inventory, not sinister intent. They reminded the jury that Kristen had once been praised for her care. That she had never been caught in the act. That her colleagues were relying on memory, on fear, not facts. But the facts, it turned out, were undeniable. The prosecution had charts, logs, timelines. They had motive, the disturbing thrill of playing hero, the twisted romance with a hospital security guard. They had a trail of bodies, all pointing back to one woman. And the jury believed it. On March 14, 2001, after 7 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, Kristen Gilbert was convicted on all major counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder. 2 counts of attempted murder. Each name was read aloud. Each verdict confirmed what the staff at Northampton had feared, and what the country now understood. Kristen Gilbert had betrayed her oath, her patients, and her profession in the most horrific way possible. The prosecution had sought the death penalty. In federal court, for murder on government property, it was on the table. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, hoping for justice, whatever form it might take. But after hearing emotional appeals, including from Kristen's own children, the jury opted for mercy. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Kristen Gilbert resides at FMC Carswell, a federal medical center for female inmates in Fort Worth, Texas. It is a prison, but also a hospital, a place for the mentally and physically ill. She lives among others whose lives unraveled in shadow. A nurse turned killer. A woman who once ran the codes, now reduced to silence and steel bars. She will die there. But the story she left behind continues to haunt the halls of Northampton VA, where whispers still echo, and every code blue carries a trace of doubt. In the months following Kristen Gilbert's conviction, the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center became a different place. New policies were drafted. Drug storage protocols were overhauled. Access to medications like epinephrine was placed under strict surveillance. Nurses and doctors were retrained in emergency detection, in recognizing irregular patterns, in trusting their instincts, even when those instincts went against the grain. Security measures increased. Background checks tightened. Staff were encouraged to report concerns without fear of retaliation. But some things couldn't be fixed with policy. The trauma lingered. For the families of the dead, there was no comfort in procedure. Their loved ones had gone to the hospital for care, not to be sacrificed on the altar of one woman's ego. For many, the courtroom conviction was only a partial victory. The damage had already been done. At a press conference not long after the sentencing, one woman stepped forward. She held a framed photo of her father, a veteran who had survived 2 wars, raised a family, and died in a hospital bed just days before his scheduled discharge. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "He served 2 wars and came back alive," she said. "And he died in a hospital bed in peace, until someone decided to play God." That line stuck. It was repeated in editorials, news specials, true crime documentaries. It captured what made Kristen Gilbert's case so terrifying, not just the murders, but the setting. A hospital. A sanctuary. A place meant for healing, turned into a silent hunting ground. For the staff who had worked beside her, the betrayal was personal. Many had trusted Kristen. Some had admired her. A few had considered her a friend. And nearly all of them had missed the signs. "She seemed so normal," one nurse later said. "She smiled. She helped. She brought cookies to the break room." And all the while, patients were dying. Kristen Gilbert never confessed. Not in the courtroom. Not in prison. Not to the press. She has never expressed remorse or acknowledged responsibility. Her attorneys maintained she was wrongfully accused, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the government needed a scapegoat.